Part 1. Hello, my friend, and welcome. Tonight, there is no need to rush anywhere. The day is finally behind you. The emails can wait until tomorrow. The laundry can stay exactly where it is. The dishes will still be there in the morning. For the next little while, none of those things matter. All that matters is that you've found a quiet place to rest. Whether you're lying in bed with the lights turned low, relaxing on the couch after a long day, or simply looking for something peaceful to listen to, I'm truly glad you're here. Tonight, we're taking a slow journey into one of the most fascinating civilizations the world has ever known. A place where every sunrise brought life to an endless river. A place where farmers quietly watched the seasons instead of clocks. A place where bread was baked before dawn, boats drifted with the current, children played beneath palm trees, and millions of ordinary people lived lives that history books rarely talk about. We're traveling back nearly 4,000 years to ancient Egypt. Now, before we begin, take one slow, deep breath and let it go. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to remember. Tonight, history will do all the work. You simply have to listen. And if you happen to fall asleep somewhere along the Nile, well, that would make the ancient Egyptians very happy, because life along the river was never meant to be rushed. It flowed slowly, quietly, patiently, just like this story, long before skyscrapers reached toward the clouds, long before highways stretched across continents, long before electricity lit cities throughout the night. The Nile River quietly carved its way through northeastern Africa, year after year, century after century. The river continued flowing. Kings came, kings disappeared. Entire dynasties rose to incredible power before slowly fading into memory. But the Nile never hurried. It simply continued its endless journey north toward the Mediterranean Sea. Ancient Egyptians believed the river was a precious gift. Without it, almost everything around them would have been lifeless desert. If you were standing there nearly 4,000 years ago, the contrast would have amazed you. On one side, golden sand stretched toward the horizon. On the other, green fields shimmered beneath the morning sunlight. Palm trees gently swayed in the breeze. Birds circled above shallow marshes. Small fishing boats floated quietly across calm water. The difference between life and death could sometimes be measured by only a few hundred feet. Everything depended upon the Nile. And because everything depended upon the river became part of everyday life. Children learned to swim in it, farmers prayed for it, merchants traveled along it, priests honored it. Artists painted it, poets praised it. No matter where someone lived in Egypt, the Nile was always nearby. Every morning began almost the same way, before sunrise. The sky slowly shifted from deep blue to soft purple soon. Orange light touched the eastern horizon. Roosters crowed, dogs stretched after sleeping through the cool desert night. Smoke slowly rose from simple mud brick homes. Inside those homes, families quietly woke one by one. There were no alarm clocks, no smartphones buzzing beside the bed, no television playing morning news. Instead, people simply woke with the sun. The air still felt cool. This was the best time to begin the day's work. Women carefully ground wheat and barley using heavy stone grinding tools. The steady scraping sound echoed softly through nearby homes. Grain slowly became flour, flour became dough, dough became warm bread. The smell drifted through narrow village streets before sunrise had fully arrived. Fresh bread was one of life's greatest comforts, even today. Thousands of years later, very few smells feel as welcoming as bread baking in the early morning. Ancient Egyptians would probably agree. Part 2, the first loaves came from simple clay ovens that had already been warmed before dawn. There were no timers, no electric mixers, no stainless steel kitchens. Everything depended on experience that had been passed from one generation to the next. A mother showed her daughter how the dough should feel beneath her hands. A father taught his son exactly when the oxen were ready for the fields. Grandparents shared stories while quietly repairing baskets or fishing nets. Knowledge rarely came from books. Instead, it lived inside people. Entire lifetimes of experience were carried through conversations, habits, and patient observation. As sunlight slowly spread across the Nile Valley, villages became fully awake. Children laughed while chasing one another through narrow dirt paths. Donkeys carried baskets of vegetables toward local markets. A flock of white ibises glided gracefully over the water before disappearing into the reeds. Somewhere nearby, a fisherman untied the rope holding his small wooden boat to the riverbank. He wasn't in a hurry. The fish had been there yesterday. They would almost certainly be there today. Life along the Nile rewarded patience far more often than speed. The fisherman stepped carefully into his boat. Its wooden planks creaked softly beneath his sandals. The river barely moved. Morning mist floated gently above the water like a thin white blanket. Using a long wooden pole, he quietly pushed away from shore. The village slowly became smaller behind him. The only sounds were birds calling across the marshes and the gentle splash of water against the side of the boat. For a few peaceful moments, it was almost perfectly silent. Many of the fish caught that morning would never travel very far. Most would be eaten within the same village before sunset. Without refrigeration, food had to be prepared carefully. Some fish were dried beneath the hot Egyptian sun. Others were salted to preserve them for weeks or even months. Nothing useful was wasted. Ancient Egyptians had learned long ago that survival depended on respecting every resource the Nile provided. Meanwhile, farmers were already hard at work. The rich black soil left behind by the annual flood was soft beneath their feet. Simple wooden plows, pulled by patient oxen, carved straight lines across the fields. Unlike modern tractors that could prepare acres in a single afternoon, these farmers measured progress one careful step at a time. The work was repetitive, slow, quiet. Yet there was something almost peaceful about its rhythm: push, step, turn, repeat, hour after hour, season after season, year after year. Many of these families worked the same land their grandparents had cultivated. Some fields had been producing grain for centuries. The people changed. The river remained. One of the most remarkable things about ancient Egypt was how predictable life could be. Modern life often changes overnight. New technology appears, cities expand, jobs disappear, entire industries transform within a generation. Ancient Egypt was different. A farmer born in one century might recognize the daily routine of a farmer who had lived 300 years earlier. The tools looked nearly the same. The crops were familiar. The seasons followed the same dependable pattern. This stability gave people confidence. They trusted the river. They trusted the seasons. They trusted that tomorrow would probably look very much like today, and for many people, that was comforting. Not every family farmed. Some became skilled craftsmen whose work was admired throughout Egypt. Potters shaped wet clay into graceful bowls, jars, cups, and storage vessels. Watching a master potter was almost hypnotic. A lump of soft clay rested on the spinning wheel. Gentle hands pressed against it slowly. Almost magically, the clay began rising. A wide bowl appeared, then a narrow-necked jar, then a perfectly balanced vase. Each movement was smooth, careful, almost effortless after decades of practice. Nearby, another craftsman carved beautiful wooden furniture. Egypt had fewer forests than many parts of the world, making good wood surprisingly valuable. Imported cedar from Lebanon was especially prized. The finest furniture belonged to wealthy officials, priests, and members of the royal family. But ordinary homes also contained simple wooden stools, low tables, storage chests, and beds woven from rope. Life did not require luxury. It required usefulness. As the morning became warmer, the village market slowly filled with people. There was no loud shouting, no flashing signs, no cash registers. Merchants displayed baskets overflowing with onions, garlic, figs, dates, cucumbers, and fresh herbs. Others offered woven baskets, linen clothing, pottery, sandals, rope, or carefully crafted jewelry made from colorful stones. Trading was as much about conversation as commerce. Neighbors greeted one another. Children wandered between stalls, fascinated by everything they saw. News traveled quickly here. A traveler arriving by boat might bring stories from another town hundreds of miles away. Perhaps a new temple was being built. Perhaps the floodwaters had risen earlier than expected. Perhaps a royal messenger had passed through the region. Without newspapers or radio, every visitor became a storyteller, and every marketplace became a place where history quietly spread from one conversation to the next. The pace remained gentle. No one seemed eager to rush home. Life unfolded exactly as it always had. One peaceful day beside the Nile at a time. Part 3. By the time the sun climbed higher into the clear Egyptian sky, the cool air of the morning had quietly disappeared. Heat settled gently across the Nile Valley. The light reflected from the river like polished glass, making the water shimmer beneath the bright blue sky. For many workers, this was the moment to slow their pace. Ancient Egyptians understood something that people in the modern world often forget. Nature always sets the schedule, not the clock, not a calendar notification, not an email waiting for an answer. The hottest hours of the day demanded patience. Those who ignored the sun usually paid for it with exhaustion. So work continued, but never in a frantic rush. Farmers paused beneath the shade of date palms. Boat builders rested inside open workshops where a soft breeze drifted through wooden beams. Stone carvers wiped fine limestone dust from their hands before taking a drink of cool water stored inside large clay jars. These jars were remarkable in their simplicity. Their porous walls allowed tiny amounts of water to evaporate. That evaporation naturally cooled the water inside, creating a refreshing drink even under the intense Egyptian sun. No electricity, no refrigeration, only a clever understanding of nature. Many of history's greatest inventions were surprisingly quiet. They didn't change the world overnight. Instead, they made everyday life just a little easier. Nearby, children continued playing as though the heat hardly existed. Some skipped smooth stones across the edge of the Nile. Others carefully built miniature boats from bundles of reeds, pretending they were captains sailing toward distant cities. Their laughter echoed across the water before fading into the gentle sounds of birds and flowing reeds. In many ways, childhood looked surprisingly familiar. Children have always been curious. They have always invented games. They have always asked endless questions. Thousands of years may separate us from ancient Egypt, but the joyful imagination of a child has changed very little. Inside one modest mud brick home, an elderly grandmother patiently repaired a woven basket. Her hands moved slowly but confidently. Every strip of papyrus had its proper place. Every movement reflected decades of experience. She did not hurry. She had learned long ago that careful work usually lasted longer than hurried work. As she worked, younger members of the family listened to stories they had heard many times before. Stories about great floods, stories about wise ancestors, stories explaining why the Nile returned every year with its life-giving waters. Some stories were based on real events. Others blended history with legend. To the people listening, the difference hardly mattered. The stories connected generations. They reminded children that they belonged to something much older than themselves. Long before books filled libraries, history survived because people remembered. They spoke, they listened. They passed knowledge from one generation to the next. Memory itself became a library. Not far away, scribes quietly continued their work. Among all professions in ancient Egypt, becoming a scribe was one of the most respected. Most people could not read or write. Writing required years of study, endless practice, and remarkable patience. Young apprentices copied symbols again and again until every line appeared perfect. Their writing was more than decoration. It was the language of government, religion, trade, and history. Using brushes made from reeds and ink created from soot mixed with water, scribes filled long sheets of papyrus with elegant hieroglyphs and flowing hieratic script. Each document preserved something important: a shipment of grain, a list of workers, a tax record, a royal order, a temple inventory. At first glance, these records might seem ordinary, but thousands of years later, they became priceless windows into everyday Egyptian life, because someone carefully recorded how many baskets of wheat entered a storage house. Modern historians can better understand ancient agriculture, because another scribe listed the daily food given to pyramid workers. We now know those workers were often well-fed, skilled laborers rather than enslaved people, as popular myths once suggested. History often survives because someone quietly decided to write things down. Outside the village, the Nile continued its endless journey north. Large boats carrying limestone drifted with the current toward construction sites many miles away. Others transported grain, linen, pottery, or timber imported from distant lands. The river served as Egypt's greatest highway. There were no paved roads connecting every settlement. The Nile connected nearly everything. Traveling by boat was often easier, faster, and far more comfortable than crossing the hot desert on foot. The sails caught the gentle northern breeze. When the wind blew from the north, boats sailed south. When traveling north, crews simply allowed the current to carry them downstream. It was an elegant partnership between water and wind. Nature provided both directions. The Egyptians simply learned how to use them wisely. As afternoon slowly unfolded, life remained calm. The rhythm never changed dramatically. No loud factories, no traffic jams, no ringing phones. Only the soft sounds of a civilization living in harmony with the river that had sustained it for thousands of years. And somewhere beyond the fields, beyond the palm trees, and beyond the quiet villages, the Great Pyramid stood beneath the endless blue sky, silent, patient, watching another peaceful day come and go along the timeless Nile. Part 4. The afternoon passed almost unnoticed. The bright Egyptian sun still hung high above the Nile, but its warmth had softened ever so slightly. Long shadows slowly began stretching across the fields, reaching farther with every passing hour. For many families, this was the most comfortable part of the day. The hardest work had already been finished. There was no rush to accomplish one more task before sunset. Ancient Egyptians understood that tomorrow would arrive soon enough. Across the river, fishermen gently checked the woven traps they had placed earlier that morning. Some traps held only a few fish, others were surprisingly full. No one expected every day to bring the same reward. The Nile was generous, but it also reminded people to remain patient. Some days offered abundance. Other days offered lessons. A fisherman accepted both with quiet gratitude. Nearby, a flock of white egrets landed gracefully in the shallow water. They stood perfectly still for several moments before striking with astonishing speed, catching tiny fish hidden beneath the surface. Ancient Egyptians watched these birds carefully. Nature was their greatest teacher. Every animal had something to reveal. The flight of birds hinted at changing weather. The movement of crocodiles warned fishermen where it might be dangerous to sail. Even the smallest insects quietly announced the changing seasons. Living beside the Nile meant paying attention, not to clocks, but to nature. In the distance, farmers slowly gathered bundles of harvested flax. Unlike wheat or barley, flax served another important purpose. Its long fibers became linen. Almost every piece of clothing in ancient Egypt began as flax growing quietly beside the river. The process required remarkable patience. After harvesting, the plants were soaked in water. The fibers were separated. They were dried beneath the warm Egyptian sun, then carefully combed, twisted into thread, and finally woven into cloth. One simple linen tunic represented weeks of careful work. Nothing happened quickly. Perhaps that is one reason life itself felt slower. Every object carried the memory of the hands that had created it. A basket remembered the weaver. A loaf of bread remembered the baker. A fishing net remembered the fisherman who patiently repaired every broken strand. As afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, merchants packed away their goods. Clay jars were stacked neatly inside storage rooms. Fresh vegetables were covered with woven mats to protect them from the remaining heat. Children helped their parents without being asked more than once. Helping the family was simply part of growing up. Responsibility arrived early in ancient Egypt. Yet childhood still found plenty of room for joy. Some boys practiced throwing small wooden sticks at imaginary targets. Others skipped flat stones across quiet pools near the riverbank. Girls braided one another's hair while laughing about stories shared earlier that day. Simple games filled the hours before sunset. No batteries, no screens, only imagination. As the golden light of late afternoon covered the Nile, the entire landscape seemed to glow. The mud brick houses reflected soft shades of amber. Palm trees cast graceful shadows over narrow footpaths. The river shimmered like polished bronze beneath the fatting sun. It was one of the most beautiful moments of the day. Travelers who visited Egypt thousands of years ago often described the remarkable colors of the evening sky: soft gold, warm orange, gentle pink, deep violet. The desert itself seemed to change color as daylight slowly disappeared. Even today, people standing beside the Nile witness much of that same breathtaking view. Some things have changed dramatically over 4,000 years. Others have hardly changed at all. A gentle breeze finally arrived from the north. Families welcomed the cooler air after the long afternoon heat. Doors were left open. Neighbors sat together outside their homes. Conversations flowed naturally from one topic to another. Someone mentioned the coming harvest. Another wondered whether this year's flood might arrive a little earlier than expected. An elderly man quietly recalled stories his grandfather had once told him about an especially generous flood many decades before. Nobody interrupted. Everyone listened. Stories were treasured. Not because they were exciting, but because they connected people to the generations that came before them. As darkness slowly approached, oil lamps began appearing inside homes throughout the village. Their small flames flickered gently against mud brick walls. The village grew quieter with every passing minute. The busiest hours of the day were over. Now came the peaceful hours, hours meant for family, for conversation, for rest, for gratitude. The Nile continued flowing beside them, exactly as it had yesterday, exactly as it would tomorrow, and exactly as it would for thousands of years still to come. For the people of ancient Egypt, there was great comfort in that quiet certainty. The river never hurried, neither did they. Part 5. As the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the western desert, a gentle stillness settled over the Nile Valley. The air cooled almost immediately. After the heat of the afternoon, the evening breeze felt wonderfully refreshing. One by one, families finished their evening meals. For most people, dinner was simple but satisfying. Fresh bread rested beside bowls of lentils. Onions, cucumbers, and leafy greens were shared among family members. Some homes enjoyed dried or freshly caught fish. Others added dates or sweet figs to end the meal. It was not a feast. It was an ordinary dinner. Yet those ordinary meals quietly sustained one of history's greatest civilizations. There were no restaurants to visit, no delivery drivers arriving at the door. Nearly every meal had been prepared by the same hands that would now gather around it: parents, children, grandparents. Sometimes neighbors joined as well. Sharing food was about more than filling an empty stomach. It strengthened friendships. It reminded everyone that no one truly lived alone. Across the village, soft conversations floated through the evening air. The loud sounds of daytime work had disappeared. In their place came quieter moments. Someone laughed gently after hearing an old family story. A baby yawned before falling asleep in its mother's arms. A loyal dog curled up beside the doorway, keeping silent watch over the home. Far above, the sky slowly filled with stars. Without electric lights, the heavens appeared brighter than most people today can imagine. The Milky Way stretched across the darkness like a pale river of light. To the ancient Egyptians, the night sky was not empty. It was alive with meaning. Every familiar star seemed to follow a dependable path. Priests carefully observed these movements year after year. Their knowledge helped predict the seasons, organize religious festivals, and even estimate the arrival of the Nile's annual flood. One star was especially important. Before dawn on certain mornings, the brilliant star Sirius appeared just above the eastern horizon. Its return announced that the life-giving flood was not far away. For generations, people eagerly watched for this moment. The appearance of Sirius became one of the most reliable signs that another agricultural year was about to begin. Long before satellites or weather forecasts, careful observation of the night sky helped entire civilizations prepare for the future. It was science, even if they called it something else. Along the riverbank, several fishermen prepared for a different kind of work. Night fishing often brought new opportunities. The water became calmer after sunset. Some species of fish moved closer to the surface. Small oil lamps placed near the edge of the boat reflected softly across the dark water. Insects gathered around the light. Soon, curious fish followed. It was a quiet and patient method that required almost no words. The only sounds came from the gentle splash of an oar, the distant call of a night bird, and the endless whisper of the Nile flowing toward the sea. Back inside the village, mothers carefully folded linen blankets, Children, exhausted after a full day of exploring, helping, and playing, drifted into peaceful sleep. Many of them had never traveled farther than a neighboring village. The world they knew was small, yet to them it felt wonderfully complete. Their river provided food, their fields provided grain, their neighbors provided friendship. Their families provided love and guidance. They did not dream of distant continents they had never heard of. Instead, they found comfort in the familiar rhythm of each passing season. Even the elders seemed unhurried. Some sat quietly outside, watching the stars without saying a single word. Silence was not uncomfortable. It was simply another part of life. There was no need to fill every moment with conversation. Sometimes the greatest peace came from listening to the breeze moving through the palm leaves, listening to frogs calling from the marshes, listening to the river that had quietly carried countless generations before them. As the night grew deeper, the village slowly disappeared into darkness. Only a handful of small oil lamps continued glowing inside scattered homes. The great temples, standing many miles away, became dark silhouettes beneath the stars. Even the mighty pyramids rested in silence. For a few precious hours, kings, farmers, scribes, fishermen, craftsmen, and children all shared the same peaceful sky. Tomorrow would bring another sunrise, another loaf of bread, another journey across the river, another ordinary day that would quietly become part of history. And the Nile, faithful as ever, continued its endless journey through the heart of ancient Egypt. Part 6 morning returned so gradually that it was almost impossible to notice the exact moment when night became day. The stars faded one by one. The eastern horizon glowed with a soft ribbon of pale gold. A cool breeze drifted across the Nile, carrying the fresh scent of water mixed with damp earth. For a few quiet moments, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, almost as if following an invisible signal, life slowly awakened. A rooster announced the new day. Birds hidden among the papyrus reeds answered with cheerful songs. A donkey shook its head, its small bell producing a gentle clink that echoed through the still village. Ancient Egypt was awake once again. Every sunrise reminded the people of something important. The sun had returned. To them, this was more than an ordinary event. It represented renewal, another opportunity to work, to care for family, and to live in harmony with the rhythm of the river. Children were often the first to step outside. Barefoot, they wandered into the cool morning air before the ground became warm beneath the rising sun. Some carried small clay jars to collect fresh water. Others gathered bundles of dry reeds for cooking fires. These simple chores were part of everyday life. No one considered them unusual. Responsibility arrived naturally, even at a young age. Inside the homes, the smell of baking bread filled the air once again. Every household seemed to move with quiet confidence. There was no confusion, no frantic rushing. Everyone understood what the day required. That sense of routine brought comfort. Modern life often celebrates constant change. Ancient Egypt celebrated dependable patterns. The flood would come, the fields would grow, the harvest would arrive, the seasons would continue. Life felt secure because nature itself was reliable. As sunlight spread across the fields, farmers inspected young crops that had begun pushing through the rich black soil. Tiny green shoots stretched toward the sky. Though small and fragile, they represented hope for the months ahead. A successful harvest depended on countless ordinary days exactly like this one. Steady sunshine, healthy soil, enough water, and patient care. Nothing extraordinary, just consistency. Perhaps that was one of ancient Egypt's greatest secrets. Its civilization became remarkable because millions of ordinary tasks were repeated faithfully for thousands of years. Nearby, a young apprentice walked beside an experienced stonemason. The older craftsman carried only a few simple tools: a wooden mallet, copper chisels, smooth measuring cords. To modern eyes, the equipment looked almost primitive. Yet these modest tools helped create monuments that still stand after more than 4,000 years. The apprentice watched carefully. He rarely interrupted. Instead, he learned by observing every movement. The master explained how limestone behaved when struck at different angles. Too much force could split an entire block. Too little accomplished nothing at all. Every tap required judgment. Every cut demanded patience. This was not work that could be rushed. Elsewhere, women gathered near the riverbank to wash linen garments. They laughed together while gently scrubbing fabric against smooth stones. Children played nearby, occasionally splashing one another before quickly returning to help. The simple act of washing clothes became another opportunity for conversation. News traveled naturally. Someone mentioned a cousin expecting a child. Another spoke about traders who had recently arrived from a distant town farther south. Life's biggest events often spread quietly through conversations beside the river. There were no headlines, no broadcasts, only voices carried by the morning breeze. As the village became busier, a caravan appeared on the dusty path leading toward the Nile. Several donkeys carried carefully balanced bundles tied with woven rope. The travelers had spent days crossing the desert between settlements. Their arrival attracted curious children almost immediately. Visitors always brought something interesting. Perhaps unfamiliar spices, perhaps colorful stones, perhaps stories from distant temples or busy trading ports. In a world without photographs or maps, travelers expanded people's understanding of the world. Every journey added another chapter to the shared knowledge of the village. The merchants greeted local families with warm smiles. Business would begin soon enough. First came hospitality, a drink of cool water, fresh bread, a chance to rest beneath the shade before continuing their work. Generosity toward travelers was deeply respected. Anyone who spent enough time beside the Nile understood that one day they, too, might depend upon the kindness of strangers. The morning continued at its gentle pace. Boats drifted peacefully along the river. Palm leaves rustled softly overhead. The bright Egyptian sun climbed steadily higher. Another ordinary day had begun. And like countless mornings before it, the people of ancient Egypt quietly embraced it. Not with hurry, not with worry, but with calm hearts and patient hands. Part 7. As the morning unfolded, the village settled into its familiar rhythm once again. From a distance, the Nile appeared almost motionless. Its surface reflected the brilliant blue sky so perfectly that the river and the heavens seemed to become one. A gentle breeze rippled the water only occasionally, creating small waves that shimmered like polished glass. It was difficult to imagine that this quiet river had shaped one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. Yet every field, every village, every temple, and every city owed its existence to these calm waters. Not far from the village stood a grove of towering date palms. Their broad leaves swayed softly in the wind, offering welcome shade beneath the growing heat of the day. Several farmers paused there for a short rest. They sat on woven reed mats while sharing bread, dried figs, and cool water stored inside clay jars. There was little conversation. No one felt the need to fill every silence. Instead, they listened. The wind whispered through the palm leaves, doves cooed from the branches above. Somewhere in the distance, an ox slowly pulled a wooden plow across another field. The steady creak of wood blended naturally with the sounds of the countryside. For the people of ancient Egypt, silence was not empty. It was comforting. Modern life often surrounds us with constant noise, engines, phones, televisions, notifications, music playing in the background. The ancient world was different. Long stretches of peaceful quiet were completely normal. Perhaps that is why people noticed the small sounds more clearly. The flutter of bird wings, the splash of a fish breaking the surface, the rustle of reeds along the riverbank. Each sound belonged exactly where it should. Nearby, a group of young boys watched an elderly fisherman repairing his net. The old man worked slowly, his weathered fingers moving with remarkable precision. Each knot had to be tied correctly. One weak section could allow several fish to escape. The boys asked questions from time to time, but mostly they watched. Lessons were rarely rushed. The fisherman smiled as he explained that a good net was much like a good friendship. Both required patience, both needed regular care, and both became stronger over time. The children nodded thoughtfully. Whether they fully understood his meaning or not hardly mattered. The lesson would remain with them for years. Across the river, another boat approached the village landing. Its square linen sail billowed gently in the northern breeze. Unlike the small fishing boats used each day, this vessel carried goods from a larger town farther upstream. Bundles of papyrus, large storage jars filled with grain, rolls of carefully woven linen, and several wooden crates containing fragrant cedar wood imported from distant lands. The arrival of a trading boat was always welcome, not because it brought excitement, but because it quietly connected one community to another. Egypt may have stretched for hundreds of miles along the Nile, yet the river allowed ideas, people, and goods to move with surprising ease. The Nile was more than water. It was a living road, without wheels turning across paved highways, without railroads, without airplanes. The river carried nearly everything that mattered. As the cargo was unloaded, a local scribe carefully recorded each shipment. Nothing was left to memory alone. The amount of grain, the number of jars, the ownership of valuable timber. Every detail was written neatly onto sheets of papyrus. These records protected both buyers and sellers. They also reveal something fascinating about ancient Egypt. It was an organized society. Behind every magnificent temple stood careful planning. Behind every harvest stood detailed records. Behind every successful trade stood someone quietly writing everything down. History often celebrates kings and monuments. Yet civilizations survive because ordinary people keep accurate records. While the scribe worked, a curious young apprentice sat nearby practicing his own writing. His reed pen moved slowly across the papyrus. One symbol, then another, again and again. Mistakes were gently corrected. Perfection came only through repetition. Years would pass before he earned the title of scribe. But every expert had once been a beginner. The villagers understood this well. No child was expected to master a skill in a single day. Patience was considered a strength. As the sun climbed higher, the marketplace gradually grew quieter. Most business had already been completed during the cooler hours of the morning. Merchants covered their goods with woven cloth to protect them from the bright sunlight. A shepherd guided his small flock toward fresh grazing land near the edge of the floodplain. Life continued exactly as it had yesterday, and very likely, exactly as it would tomorrow. There was a quiet beauty in that predictability. The Nile flowed steadily beside them. The fields remained green. The palms continued swaying in the breeze. And another peaceful day unfolded across the timeless landscape of ancient Egypt. Part 8. By midday, the Egyptian sun stood high above the valley. Its warm light poured across the fields, temples, and quiet villages with remarkable intensity. Even the birds seemed to slow their movements. The breeze that had gently cooled the morning became softer now, carrying only the faint scent of the river and the distant sweetness of blooming lotus flowers. For many families, this was the hour to seek shade. Large sycamore fig trees offered welcome relief from the afternoon heat. Farmers rested beneath their wide branches, sharing cool water from earthen jars while enjoying simple meals prepared before sunrise. A loaf of coarse bread, a handful of dates, fresh onions, perhaps a small piece of salted fish. Nothing extravagant, yet every meal reminded them of the river's generosity. Without the Nile, none of this would have existed. Nearby, an elderly farmer quietly observed the fields stretching toward the horizon. He had spent nearly 60 harvests working this same land. He knew every bend in the irrigation canals, every patch of especially fertile soil, every tree that had survived countless seasons. When younger workers asked how he always seemed to know exactly when to plant or harvest, he simply smiled. "River tells you," he would often say. "You only have to learn how to listen." It sounded almost poetic, but there was truth behind his words. The color of the water, the height of the flood, the direction of the wind, the behavior of birds, even the appearance of certain insects offered clues about the changing seasons. Long before modern science explained these patterns, careful observation had already become a reliable guide. Across the village, potters continued their work inside shaded workshops. The spinning wheel turned slowly beneath practiced hands. A shapeless lump of clay gradually transformed into a graceful storage jar. Another became a wide bowl. Another became a delicate drinking cup. Each piece looked slightly different. No two vessels were ever exactly alike. That was the quiet beauty of handmade craftsmanship. Every fingerprint, every gentle curve, every tiny imperfection reminded people that a human hand had created it. Once shaped, The pottery was placed carefully beneath the sun to dry before being fired inside large kilns. Some of these simple jars would carry grain. Others would store cooking oil or honey. Some would survive only a few years. A few would remain buried beneath the desert for thousands of years, waiting for archaeologists to uncover them. Today, museums around the world display many of these ordinary objects. Visitors often admire the great statues and golden treasures first. Yet historians know that simple household pottery often tells a much richer story about everyday life. It reveals what people ate, how they cooked, how they stored food, even how families organized their homes. Sometimes the smallest discoveries answer the biggest questions. Not far away, women sat together weaving linen on large wooden looms. The rhythmic movement of thread passing back and forth created a soft, soothing sound. Click, pull, tight, repeat. The pattern continued for hours. There was almost a musical quality to it. Young girls watched carefully from nearby, learning each step through quiet observation. One day they would teach their own daughters the very same skill. Knowledge traveled through families like the Nile itself. Steady, continuous, never hurried. As the afternoon slowly unfolded, a pair of travelers arrived carrying news from a town farther north. They spoke of a new temple whose stone columns were rising higher each month. Hundreds of skilled workers had gathered there: stonecutters, painters, carpenters, sculptors, priests, bakers, boatmen. Building a temple required far more than architects alone. Entire communities contributed their talents. Even those who never touched a single stone helped by growing food, weaving clothing, or transporting supplies. Great achievements rarely belong to one person. They belong to thousands of ordinary people working together over many years. The travelers rested beneath the shade while sharing their stories. Children listened with wide eyes. For them, distant cities sounded almost magical. Some dreamed that one day they might travel beyond their own village. Others felt perfectly content knowing the Nile would always bring new stories to them. Neither choice was wrong. Life offered many paths. As the afternoon sun slowly drifted westward, long shadows once again began stretching across the fertile fields. The busiest hours were ending. Soon the air would cool, families would gather, boats would return to shore, and another peaceful evening would gently settle over the timeless waters of the Nile. The river, unchanged by human ambition, continued its quiet journey toward the sea. Just as it always had, and just as it always would. Part 9. As the afternoon slowly gave way to evening, the sunlight became softer. The brilliant white light of midday transformed into a warm golden glow that stretched across the Nile Valley. The river reflected the colors of the sky like a polished mirror: orange, gold, hints of rose. Every ripple carried the fatting sunlight a little farther downstream. For many villagers, this was their favorite time of day. The hardest work was finished. The evening breeze had returned. The air felt lighter. Across the fields, farmers gathered their wooden tools and brushed the rich black soil from their sandals before beginning the walk home. They did not measure success by how quickly they finished. Instead, they measured it by whether the crops were healthy, the family was fed, and the river remained kind. It was a quieter definition of prosperity, one that required patience rather than speed. Along the riverbank, fishermen guided their small boats back toward shore. Their nets rested in neat piles beside baskets containing the day's catch. Some days brought many fish, other days only a handful. Either way, the fishermen accepted the river's decision with remarkable calm. They understood that nature could never be forced, only respected. As one elderly fisherman gently secured his boat with a length of woven rope, his grandson asked him a simple question. "Grandfather, how do you always know where the fish will be?" The old man smiled. "I don't always know," he answered. "I simply pay attention." He pointed toward the water. Birds, the reeds, current, the wind, they are always speaking. Just have to remember how to listen. Boy looked out across the river. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed a flock of birds circling low above the water. Without another word, the old fisherman nodded. The lesson had begun, not with a lecture, but with observation. In ancient Egypt, wisdom often arrived quietly. Nearby, women returned from the river carrying smooth clay jars balanced carefully upon their heads. The jars seemed surprisingly heavy. Yet years of practice allowed them to walk with graceful confidence. Not a single drop spilled onto the dusty path. Children hurried ahead, laughing as they chased one another through the village. A small puppy bounded after them, its oversized paws kicking tiny clouds of dust into the evening air. Someone nearby began humming a familiar tune while repairing a woven basket outside their home. There were no orchestras, no recorded music, yet songs still filled everyday life. Simple melodies passed from parent to child over countless generations. Some celebrated the harvest, others praised the Nile. Many had no special occasion at all. People simply enjoyed singing while they worked. Music made long hours feel lighter. As the sun slipped closer to the western horizon, long shadows stretched across the mud brick homes. Palm trees stood like quiet guardians along the edge of the village. Their leaves whispered gently each time the evening breeze passed through them. Nearby, cattle slowly wandered back toward their shelters after grazing throughout the day. Goats followed close behind, their soft calls echoing through the peaceful countryside. Dust rose beneath their hooves before settling once again upon the earth. Even the animals seemed to understand that the day was ending. High above, several swallows darted through the fading light, catching insects before darkness arrived. For a brief moment, the sky seemed alive with graceful movement. Then, just as quickly, the birds disappeared toward their nests. The pace of the village. Part 10 night settled gently across the Nile Valley. The last trace of orange disappeared beyond the western horizon, leaving behind a sky so clear that it seemed almost endless. Thousands upon thousands of stars slowly appeared. Without the glow of city lights, the heavens revealed themselves in breathtaking detail. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a pale ribbon of silver. For the people of ancient Egypt, this was a familiar sight. Every evening, the sky became a great storybook. Each constellation carried meaning. Each bright star marked the passage of time. Children often lay beside their parents, looking upward in quiet wonder. They asked the same questions children have always asked. What is that bright star? How far away is the moon? Will the stars always stay there? Parents answered with stories passed down through generations. Some tales spoke of gods sailing across the heavens. Others explained how the stars watched over the world while people slept. Whether every story was literally true mattered less than the comfort it brought. The night sky reminded everyone that they were part of something much larger than themselves. As darkness deepened, small oil lamps flickered inside the mud brick homes. Their soft golden light danced across the walls, creating gentle shadows that shifted with every movement of the flame. There was no harsh brightness, only a warm, peaceful glow. Families gathered together after supper. The pace of conversation slowed. An elderly grandmother continued weaving a basket she had begun several days earlier. Her hands moved almost automatically. She no longer needed to think about each movement. Years of experience guided her fingers. Across the room, a young boy carefully shaped a tiny boat from scraps of papyrus. He imagined it sailing the entire length of the Nile, visiting magnificent temples and distant cities he had only heard about in stories. His father smiled but said nothing. Dreams were precious. Even in a small village, they deserved room to grow. Outside, the sounds of the village became fewer with every passing minute. A donkey shifted quietly in its shelter. A dog barked once in the distance before settling down again. The steady chorus of frogs echoed from the marshes near the riverbank. Their calls blended with the gentle whisper of the breeze moving through the papyrus reeds. It was a peaceful symphony created entirely by nature. Far from the village, a temple priest climbed a stone staircase leading to the roof of a sanctuary. From there, he could observe the stars without obstruction. Egyptian priests were among the most careful observers of the night sky. For centuries, they recorded the movements of heavenly bodies with remarkable precision. They noticed patterns. They compared seasons. They learned that the appearance of certain stars coincided with important changes in the natural world. Their observations helped determine the calendar that guided farming, festivals, and daily life. It was careful science born from quiet patience. Meanwhile, along the river, a lone watchman slowly walked the shoreline. His task was simple. He checked that boats remained safely tied to the docks. He looked for signs of trouble. Most nights were uneventful. And that was exactly how he preferred them. A peaceful night meant everyone could sleep without worry. The moon slowly rose above the eastern horizon. Its pale reflection shimmered across the surface of the Nile, creating a silver path that seemed to stretch forever. A light breeze caused tiny ripples to dance across the water. Somewhere in the reeds, a fish briefly broke the surface before disappearing once again into the darkness. The watchman paused for a moment. He listened. Nothing but water, nothing but wind, nothing but the quiet breathing of a civilization at rest. In homes throughout the village, children had already fallen asleep. Parents whispered softly before extinguishing their oil lamps one by one. Darkness gently filled each room. Outside, the stars continued their slow journey across the heavens. The river never stopped flowing. The breeze never completely disappeared. Time itself seemed to move more slowly here. Another peaceful day had come to an end. Tomorrow, the sun would rise once again over the fertile banks of the Nile. Bread would be baked. Boats would drift along the current. Fields would welcome another day of careful work. And life, in all its quiet simplicity, would continue exactly as it had for countless generations. The ancient world did not rush toward tomorrow. It simply welcomed each new day with gratitude, patience, and the steady rhythm of the timeless Nile. Part 11, the first light of dawn, arrived so gently that even the birds seemed surprised by it. For a few peaceful moments, the world rested in a quiet balance between night and day. The stars slowly faded into the pale blue sky. The moon drifted lower toward the western horizon. A thin blanket of mist hovered just above the Nile, softening the outlines of fishing boats tied along the shore. The village remained asleep. Only the river was awake. It continued its endless journey, flowing north exactly as it had yesterday, last year, and for thousands of years before. If someone had stood beside the Nile every morning of their life, they might have believed nothing ever changed. But that was not entirely true. The changes were simply very small. A young palm tree had grown a little taller. A calf had become a full-grown ox. A child who once played beside the river was now teaching another generation how to weave baskets or plant grain. Life moved slowly enough that change almost hid itself. Perhaps that was one of ancient Egypt's greatest gifts. People were able to notice the little things. The first blossom opening on a lotus flower. The arrival of migrating birds. The cool touch of morning air before the desert heat returned. The faint scent of fresh bread drifting from a nearby home. Modern life often asks us to notice only the extraordinary. Ancient life found beauty in the ordinary. As sunlight slowly spread across the valley, smoke began curling upward from clay ovens. The village awakened once again. An elderly baker carefully removed glowing pieces of charcoal from yesterday's fire. Instead of wasting them, he used them to start the morning's oven. Fuel was valuable. Nothing useful was thrown away. Nearby, his daughter mixed freshly ground flour with water, creating soft dough inside a large clay bowl. Her movements were calm and practiced. She had watched her mother do the same work since childhood. Now, without thinking, her hands remembered every step. Soon the first round loaves rested against the hot walls of the oven. The smell was warm, rich, and comforting. Long before coffee became part of morning routines in another part of the world, fresh bread welcomed each new day in Egypt. Outside, fishermen prepared for another journey onto the water. Before pushing away from shore, one man paused to look toward the eastern sky. The weather seemed calm. The wind was gentle. The river appeared peaceful. It would be a good morning to fish. He smiled quietly. Not every decision required complicated planning. Sometimes experience was enough. A short distance away, two young brothers followed their father toward the fields. The older boy proudly carried a wooden hoe nearly as tall as he was. The younger struggled with a much smaller basket, refusing help even when it became heavy. Their father noticed but said nothing. Learning responsibility often began with simple tasks. The boys would remember mornings like this long after they had become men. Many years later, they would walk the same path with children of their own. That was how traditions survived, not through grand ceremonies, but through ordinary mornings repeated across countless generations. Farther along the riverbank, Several women gathered bundles of papyrus reeds. To most visitors, they looked like ordinary plants growing near the water. To the Egyptians, they were one of the most useful gifts of the Nile. Papyrus became rope, it became baskets, it became sandals, it became lightweight boats for short trips across calm water. Most importantly, it became writing material. After cutting the reeds, workers sliced the soft inner stem into thin strips. The strips were carefully laid side by side. Another layer crossed over the first. The sheets were pressed together and dried beneath the Egyptian sun. The result was surprisingly smooth and durable. Thousands of years later, many papyrus documents still survive. They tell us about taxes, letters between friends, medical treatments, business agreements, even shopping lists. History is often remembered through kings and monuments. Yet some of its most fascinating stories survive because an ordinary person wrote down something that seemed completely unimportant at the time. A list of grain deliveries, a family's household expenses, the number of workers repairing a canal. These simple records quietly became treasures for historians. As the village grew busier, children laughed while chasing one another between the palm trees. A small puppy eagerly joined the game, barking with excitement as it tried to keep up. An elderly woman sitting outside her home smiled as she watched them. She had seen this same joyful scene many times throughout her life. Different children, different puppy, the same laughter, the same happiness. The Nile continued flowing beside them, silent and steady. It asked for nothing. It hurried no one. It simply carried another peaceful morning into the heart of ancient Egypt, where every ordinary day slowly became another unforgettable page in the story of history. Part 12. As the morning sun climbed higher above the eastern horizon, its golden light spread across the fertile floodplain like a warm blanket. The Nile shimmered peacefully, reflecting both the endless blue sky above and the graceful palm trees that lined its banks. Small ripples formed behind passing boats, but within moments the water became smooth once again, as though nothing had disturbed it at all. The river had a remarkable way of returning to perfect calm. Perhaps that was one reason the ancient Egyptians respected it so deeply. It was powerful enough to shape an entire civilization, yet gentle enough to soothe the soul. Along one of the irrigation canals, a farmer slowly opened a small earthen gate. Cool river water quietly flowed into the narrow channel, winding its way toward rows of young barley and emmer wheat. Every drop mattered. Although the annual flood brought rich soil, careful irrigation throughout the growing season remained essential. The Egyptians became masters at guiding water exactly where it was needed. Simple canals crisscrossed the landscape. Low embankments directed the current. Wooden shovels shaped the flow. Nothing appeared complicated. Yet together these modest techniques supported millions of people for centuries. Nearby, a young apprentice asked his father why the water never stopped moving. His father smiled gently. "River has somewhere to go," he replied. "It doesn't fight the land. It simply follows its path." Boy watched the water for several moments. It slipped quietly around stones. It curved around reeds. It never argued with an obstacle. It simply found another way forward. The lesson stayed with him. Sometimes nature teaches wisdom without speaking a single word. Farther downstream, a pair of craftsmen worked beneath the shade of an acacia tree. One carefully carved a wooden spoon. The other polished the handle of a walking staff. Their tools were simple: a copper blade, a stone scraper, a smooth piece of sandstone for polishing. Hours passed with very little conversation. There was no need. The rhythm of skilled work often became its own language. Every careful cut revealed years of experience. A rushed hand left rough edges. A patient hand created beauty. The Egyptians admired precision, not because it impressed others, but because careful work honored both the material and the craftsman. Across the village, several women gathered around a large hand mill, taking turns grinding grain into fine flour. The heavy upper stone rotated slowly, producing a soft, steady scraping sound. It was one of the most familiar sounds in ancient Egypt, morning after morning, year after year, generation after generation. The rhythm rarely changed. Children sitting nearby listened almost without noticing. To them, it was simply part of home. The smell of fresh flour soon mixed with the aroma of baking bread drifting from nearby ovens. For many people, these scents defined comfort itself. Bread was more than food, it represented stability. As long as there was grain in storage and water in the Nile, families felt secure. Not every harvest was perfect, of course. Some years brought smaller floods, others produced larger ones. But over thousands of years, the remarkable consistency of the Nile allowed Egypt to thrive, while many neighboring lands struggled with uncertainty. It was one of history's greatest natural partnerships, a river, and the people who learned to live in harmony with it. Near the marketplace, merchants slowly arranged colorful goods beneath woven awnings. There were baskets filled with sweet dates gathered from nearby palms. Bundles of garlic and onions rested beside jars of fragrant honey. Pottery painted with simple geometric designs caught the morning sunlight. Fine linen cloth fluttered gently in the breeze. Travelers arriving by boat paused to admire the displays before greeting familiar faces. Trade was never only about buying and selling. It was also about conversation, friendship, news, laughter. An elderly merchant knew nearly everyone who visited his stall. He remembered their names, their families, even the kinds of bread they preferred. Business moved at the pace of trust, not speed. As the hours passed, a group of children wandered toward the edge of the village where lotus flowers floated peacefully across a quiet pond connected to the Nile. Bright blue dragonflies hovered above the water. Tiny frogs leaped from one broad leaf to another. The children sat quietly, watching the insects dance in the sunlight. No one hurried them back to work. Moments spent observing nature were never considered wasted. The world itself was a classroom. Every season offered another lesson. Every sunrise revealed something new. And every peaceful day beside the Nile quietly reminded the people of ancient Egypt that the greatest treasures in life often arrived without noise, without hurry, and without asking for attention. The river continued its timeless journey. The breeze carried the scent of fresh water across the valley. And another beautiful morning slowly became another unforgettable chapter in the long, peaceful story of ancient Egypt. Part 13, the sun continued its slow climb across the Egyptian sky. By late morning, the cool freshness of dawn had quietly faded, replaced by a gentle warmth that settled over the valley. From above, the Nile looked like a ribbon of deep blue silk winding gracefully through an ocean of golden desert. It was a striking contrast. Beyond, the green floodplain stretched miles upon miles of dry sand and rugged cliffs. Very little could grow there. Yet beside the river, life flourished. Fields of barley swayed softly in the breeze. Palm groves cast long shadows across narrow footpaths. Birds gathered among reeds where fish waded beneath the calm water. It was easy to understand why the ancient Egyptians believed the Nile was a gift unlike any other. Without it, Egypt would have been almost entirely desert. Along one of the canals, a group of farmers inspected the wooden shaduf that stood beside the water. The device was simple but ingenious. A long wooden beam rested on a sturdy upright post. A heavy stone acted as a counterweight on one end. A bucket hung from the other. With very little effort, a farmer could lower the bucket into the canal, lift it using the counterweight, and pour fresh water into nearby irrigation ditches. Again, and again, and again. The motion became almost effortless after years of practice. Although simple in appearance, the shaduf transformed farming across much of Egypt. It allowed water to reach fields lying higher than the river itself. This meant more land could be cultivated, more grain could be harvested, more families could be fed. Sometimes history changes because of grand victories. Other times, it changes because someone invents a better way to carry water. Nearby, a young girl watched her grandfather operate the shaduf. She asked why he never seemed to grow impatient. The old man smiled without stopping his work. "River has been here for thousands of years," he said softly. "It has never rushed. So why should I?" The girl looked at the flowing water for a long moment. The Nile did not hurry. It simply continued forward, one gentle current at a time. Perhaps there was wisdom in that. Across the village, the local carpenter was finishing a beautifully crafted wooden chest. He ran his fingers along the polished surface, searching for even the smallest rough spot. Finding one, he patiently smoothed it with a piece of sandstone. No customer would likely notice the tiny imperfection, but he noticed that was enough. The finest craftsmen were not guided by praise, they were guided by pride in their own work. Inside another workshop, the scent of fresh cedar wood filled the air. The timber had traveled hundreds of miles from the forests of Lebanon. Because large trees were scarce in Egypt, imported cedar was treasured. It became furniture for wealthy households. Doors for temples, strong beams for important buildings. Every piece was used carefully. Nothing valuable was wasted. Outside, the village marketplace had grown lively once again. A baker arranged warm loaves of bread in neat rows. A potter displayed newly fired jars that still held the faint warmth of the kiln. A linen merchant gently unfolded fine cloth so customers could admire its smooth texture. Nearby, a spice trader opened a small pouch filled with fragrant herbs. The air carried hints of coriander, cumin, and dried mint. People paused not only to buy, they paused to talk. An old friend greeted another with a smile. Children proudly showed handmade toys carved from scraps of wood. A traveler described seeing enormous temples farther south along the river. The marketplace was more than a place of trade. It was where the heartbeat of the community could be felt most clearly. Toward the edge of the village, several scribes sat beneath a shaded porch, carefully copying official records. Their reed pens moved steadily across sheets of papyrus. Every symbol required concentration. There was no room for carelessness. A single mistake might change the meaning of an entire document. Patience was not merely encouraged, it was essential. As the hours passed, the steady sounds of the village blended into one peaceful rhythm, the splash of water being lifted from the canal, the gentle tapping of a carpenter's tools, the distant laughter of children, the soft flutter of pigeons taking flight from a nearby rooftop. Nothing seemed hurried, nothing felt out of place. Each sound belonged to a civilization that had learned to move with the rhythm of nature rather than against it. The Nile continued to flow beside them, calm and unwavering. It had witnessed the rise of kings. It had nourished generations of farmers. It had carried merchants, priests, craftsmen, and dreamers along its waters. And on this quiet morning, just as on countless mornings before, it silently watched another ordinary day unfold, one peaceful moment at a time. Part 14. By the time the sun reached the middle of the sky, the Nile Valley seemed to glow beneath its brilliant light. The air had become warm, but life did not come to a halt. Instead, it simply slowed. The ancient Egyptians had long ago learned that there was little wisdom in racing against the midday heat. Nature always decided the pace. The people merely followed. Along the eastern bank of the Nile, a narrow path wound its way between fields of ripening grain. A farmer named Hori walked slowly beside his oldest son. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. They listened instead. The soft rustle of barley swaying in the breeze, the distant call of a heron lifting gracefully from the marsh, the gentle creaking of a wooden water wheel farther down the canal. Finally, Hori stopped and knelt beside a patch of wheat. He carefully rubbed one head of grain between his fingers. The kernels were still soft. "Yet," he said quietly. His son nodded. There was no disappointment in his voice, only understanding. Harvest would come when the grain was ready, not before. Patience had always been one of a farmer's greatest tools. Nearby, several women gathered beneath the broad branches of a sycamore fig tree. Its wide canopy offered cool shade from the afternoon sun. They shared baskets filled with bread, fresh dates, and cucumbers while exchanging stories about their families. One woman laughed as she described her young grandson chasing ducks into the river that morning. Another smiled while mending a small tear in a linen tunic. Their hands rarely stopped working, even while they talked. Every stitch, every knot, every careful repair extended the life of something valuable. In ancient Egypt, mending was often more important than replacing. A little farther downstream, two boys sat quietly at the edge of the river. Each held a simple fishing line made from twisted flax fibers. They had caught nothing yet. Neither seemed bothered. They watched dragonflies skim across the water. A turtle slowly climbed onto a warm rock. Tiny silver fish flashed beneath the surface before disappearing into deeper water. One of the boys whispered, "Do you think the river ever sleeps?" His friend thought carefully before answering. "I don't think so. Just keeps going." Boys looked out across the Nile in silence. Perhaps they were right. Day and night, season after season, century after century, the river never seemed to grow tired. Its steady current became one of the few constants in a changing world. Not far away, inside a shaded workshop, an elderly boat builder inspected the hull of a newly finished vessel. He ran his hand along the smooth wooden planks, checking every joint. The boat was not large. It would carry only a few fishermen or perhaps a family traveling to a nearby village. Yet he built it with the same care that others might reserve for a royal barge. Quality did not depend upon size. Every boat deserved to be trustworthy. Before launching it into the Nile, he whispered a quiet wish that it would always return safely to shore. Throughout Egypt, countless ordinary craftsmen shared similar hopes. A baker wished his bread would nourish every family. A potter hoped her jars would survive many seasons. A weaver prayed her linen would keep children warm during cool desert nights. Small acts of care quietly supported an entire civilization. As the afternoon breeze strengthened, the broad sails of trading boats filled with air. Several vessels drifted north with the current while others, using the dependable northern wind, slowly made their way south. The Egyptians understood these natural forces so well that they rarely fought against them. They worked with them instead. The river carried them one way. The wind carried them the other. Together, they created one of the most reliable transportation systems in the ancient world. Along the shoreline, white ibises searched patiently through the shallow water, sacred to the Egyptians and often associated with wisdom. These elegant birds moved with remarkable grace. They took slow, careful steps before striking with lightning speed whenever they spotted a small fish or insect. Children often paused to watch them. There was something calming about their quiet confidence. They never hurried. They never wasted energy. Every movement had purpose. As the afternoon slowly stretched toward evening, shadows began growing longer across the fertile fields. The intense heat softened. A cooler breeze drifted once again from the north. The busiest part of the day was nearly over. Soon families would return home. Bread would come from the ovens. Oil lamps would glow against mud brick walls. And the Nile, faithful as always, would continue its endless journey beneath another peaceful Egyptian sunset. Part 15. As the afternoon slowly slipped toward evening, the brilliant sunlight softened into shades of warm gold. The towering palm trees stretched long shadows across the narrow footpaths, and the surface of the Nile sparkled as though thousands of tiny pieces of glass floated gently upon the water. The hottest part of the day had passed. The valley seemed to breathe again. A cool northern breeze arrived with quiet confidence, carrying the scent of fresh water, damp soil, and flowering lotus blossoms. It was the kind of evening that invited people to slow down. Along the edge of a small village, an elderly woman named Tia sat outside her home with a basket of freshly harvested flax. Patiently, she separated the fibers one by one. Her hands moved almost effortlessly. She had repeated these same motions for more than 50 years. Nearby, her granddaughter watched with quiet fascination. "Does it ever become boring?" the young girl asked. Tia smiled gently without looking up. "No," she replied, "because every thread becomes part of someone's life." The little girl tilted her head. Her grandmother continued, "This thread may become a baby's blanket, or a farmer's tunic, or a sail that carries someone safely across the Nile. When you remember that, even the smallest job becomes important." Child nodded thoughtfully. She picked up a handful of flax and carefully copied her grandmother's movements, not perfectly, but with great determination. In ancient Egypt, learning rarely happened inside classrooms. It happened beside parents, grandparents, neighbors. Everyday life itself was the teacher. A short distance away, the village baker opened the clay oven for the final time that day. Warm air rushed outward, carrying the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread. Round loaves were stacked inside woven baskets lined with clean linen cloth. Some would be eaten that evening. Others would be traded in the morning market. Bread remained the foundation of nearly every meal, simple, reliable, familiar. Its smell had welcomed countless sunsets before this one, and it would welcome countless more. Down by the riverbank, several fishermen carefully cleaned their boats before nightfall. Each paddle was rinsed with fresh water. Each rope was neatly coiled. Every fishing net was inspected strand by strand. Tiny tiers were repaired immediately. A neglected net might fail tomorrow. A repaired one could serve faithfully for many more seasons. The fishermen understood something that modern life sometimes forgets. Taking care of ordinary things often prevents extraordinary problems. Nearby, an old man sat quietly carving a small wooden bird. No one had asked him to make it. It was not part of his work. He simply enjoyed carving. As the bird slowly took shape beneath his careful hands, several children gathered around to watch. One little boy whispered, "It almost looks alive." The old man laughed softly. Wood already knew it wanted to become a bird. Simply helped it. Children smiled. Perhaps they believed him. Perhaps they simply enjoyed the story. Either way, they would remember that moment for years. The evening marketplace remained peaceful. Merchants packed away jars of honey, baskets of onions, woven sandals, polished pottery, and folded linen cloth. No loud voices echoed through the square. Business had ended hours earlier. Now neighbors lingered simply because they enjoyed one another's company. Someone shared a story about seeing a family of hippos farther south along the river. Another described a temple festival that would soon take place in a neighboring town. Conversations drifted naturally from one topic to another. No one seemed eager to leave. Above them, swallows circled gracefully through the evening sky before disappearing beneath the roofs where they had built their nests. The first bats quietly emerged, replacing the birds that had filled the daylight hours. Nature itself changed shifts with remarkable order. Nothing appeared hurried. Nothing appeared confused. Everything followed its place within the rhythm of the Nile. As sunset approached, the western desert turned shades of amber and crimson. The cliffs glowed brilliantly for a few precious moments before slowly fading into deep purple. The river reflected every changing color. It was a sunset that countless generations had witnessed. Farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, children, kings, priests, travelers, all had paused at one time or another to watch the sun disappear beyond the western horizon. And every evening, the Nile remained exactly where it had always been, steady, patient, silent, waiting peacefully for another dawn to begin the story once again. Part 16. The last colors of sunset slowly faded into the western horizon. Golden light became soft amber. Amber melted into gentle shades of lavender. Soon, deep blue stretched across the entire sky. The first evening star appeared quietly above the eastern desert. One by one, countless others followed. The village welcomed the night as naturally as it had welcomed the morning. There was no sudden change, only a peaceful transition. Oil lamps began glowing inside the mud brick homes. Their warm light spilled softly through open doorways, creating little pools of golden color against the gathering darkness. The smell of fresh bread still lingered in the air. Nearby, someone added a few dry reeds to a small cooking fire. Tiny sparks floated upward before disappearing among the stars. Families gathered together for the evening meal. Most dinners were simple, fresh bread. A bowl of lentils slowly cooked with onions. A handful of olives. Perhaps a piece of grilled fish caught earlier that afternoon. Some families enjoyed sweet dates for dessert. Others shared ripe figs or grapes brought from nearby gardens. No one expected extravagant feasts. The greatest luxury was eating together. An elderly grandfather broke a loaf of bread into equal pieces before passing it around the family. No one spoke for several moments. They simply enjoyed the quiet comfort of the meal. Outside, the sounds of the village gradually softened. The steady tapping of hammers had ended. The potter's wheel stood still. The carpenter carefully covered his tools before returning home. The marketplace, busy only a few hours earlier, now rested beneath the moonlight. A gentle breeze drifted through the empty stalls. Rustling woven baskets left neatly stacked for tomorrow morning. Not far from the village, several fishermen prepared for a peaceful night on the river. Night fishing required patience. Their small boats slipped silently across the calm water. The moon reflected beautifully on the surface, creating a silver pathway that stretched far into the distance. One fisherman quietly lowered his net. He waited. There was no need to rush. The Nile always rewarded patience more generously than impatience. Along the shoreline, frogs began their nightly chorus. Crickets answered from the tall grasses. Occasionally, the distant call of an owl echoed across the valley before fading into silence once again. To modern ears, these sounds might seem unusual. To the people of ancient Egypt, they were the familiar music of home. Children listened as their mothers and fathers shared stories before bedtime. Some stories spoke of brave explorers sailing to distant lands. Others described clever animals that outwitted stronger ones. Many tales explained why the Nile flooded each year or how the stars found their places in the heavens. Whether history, legend, or imagination, every story carried a lesson. Every story helped children understand the world around them. As the younger children drifted toward sleep, the adults remained outside a little longer. Neighbors gathered beneath the stars. Someone pointed toward the bright constellation that slowly crossed the southern sky. An old farmer quietly remarked that the coming flood seemed likely to arrive on time. A boat builder nodded thoughtfully. Years of watching the river had taught him to trust such observations. They spoke calmly, without argument, without hurry. Silence often filled the spaces between conversations, and no one felt uncomfortable because of it. The night itself seemed worthy of listening to. The breeze through the palms, the steady flow of the Nile, the distant splash of a fish breaking the surface. These gentle sounds reminded everyone that life continued even while people rested. Farther away, beyond the small villages and fertile fields, the Great Pyramid stood beneath the moonlight. Their smooth limestone casing stones, still largely intact during this period, reflected the moon with a pale glow. Travelers approaching from a distance often described the sight as almost magical, massive yet peaceful, powerful yet silent. For centuries, these monuments watched over the valley without speaking a single word. They witnessed floods and harvests, births and farewells, celebrations and ordinary evenings just like this one. The people changed. The river flowed. The stars crossed the heavens. And the pyramids quietly remained. As midnight slowly approached, the village settled into complete stillness. Oil lamps were extinguished one by one. Doors remained slightly open to welcome the cool desert breeze. Families slept peacefully beneath linen blankets. The Nile continued its endless journey toward the sea. It never hurried. It never rested. It simply flowed, carrying another quiet night into the timeless heart of ancient Egypt. Part 17. Sometime during the deepest hours of the night, when nearly every lamp had gone dark and the village rested in complete silence, the Nile continued to flow as faithfully as ever. The river did not sleep. It did not pause. Its gentle current slipped quietly past reeds, small islands, and sleeping fishing boats, making only the softest whisper as it touched the muddy banks. Above, the stars slowly wheeled across the heavens. To the ancient Egyptians, this silent movement was never random. Every bright point of light followed a dependable path, night after night, year after year, generation after generation. That reliability brought comfort. It reminded them that the universe itself had an order. Far from the village, on the flat roof of a temple, two young apprentice priests sat beside their teacher. No one spoke for a long while. Instead, they watched the sky. The older priest finally lifted his hand and pointed toward a brilliant star near the horizon. "Remember where it rises," he said quietly. The apprentices nodded. They understood that careful observation mattered more than hurried guesses. Their lessons were not measured in hours. Sometimes they continued for many years. The stars rewarded patience. Just as the Nile did nearby, a small clay water clock rested on a stone platform. Drop by drop, water slowly escaped through a tiny opening. The changing water level helped temple priests estimate the passing hours during the night. It was a simple invention. Yet it reflected something remarkable about ancient Egypt. Even in a world without mechanical clocks, people searched for gentle, reliable ways to measure time, not because they wished to hurry it, but because they wished to understand it. As the night slowly passed, the air became cooler. A thin layer of dew settled upon the grasses growing near the riverbank. Tiny droplets clung to reeds and lotus leaves, sparkling faintly beneath the moonlight. By morning, most would disappear beneath the warmth of the rising sun. Their lives were brief, yet no less beautiful. Along the edge of the village, a watchman completed another quiet walk between the homes. He carried a simple wooden staff. Its purpose was less about protection than reassurance. Knowing someone remained awake allowed everyone else to sleep peacefully. He paused beside a sleeping donkey, smiled softly, and continued on his way. Nothing unusual had happened. That was exactly the kind of night he hoped for. Peace rarely becomes famous in history books. Battles receive chapters. Kings receive monuments. Victories receive celebrations. Yet ordinary peaceful nights like this one quietly allowed civilization to continue. Children slept because they felt safe. Parents rested because tomorrow's work required strength. Craftsmen recovered from long days shaping wood, clay, and stone. Farmers prepared for another sunrise beside their beloved river. History often grows strongest during quiet moments that no one notices at the time. Gradually, the eastern horizon began to change. At first, the difference was almost impossible to see. Black softened into deep blue. Then came a faint ribbon of silver. The stars nearest the horizon quietly disappeared. Birds hidden among the papyrus sensed the coming dawn before people did. One called softly. Another answered. Soon the peaceful chorus spread along the riverbank. Inside the homes, a few early risers stirred beneath their linen blankets. A baker quietly added dry reeds to yesterday's embers, carefully coaxing the fire back to life. A fisherman stepped outside and looked toward the sky. The breeze felt gentle. The river looked calm. It would be another beautiful day, he smiled. Not because something extraordinary was about to happen, but because another ordinary day beside the Nile was beginning. And in ancient Egypt, ordinary days were among life's greatest blessings. The first rays of sunlight finally reached the tops of the palm trees. Golden light spread slowly across the fields. The mist rising from the river began to disappear. Boats resting along the shoreline rocked gently against their moorings. The village awakened once more. Bread would soon be baking. Markets would slowly fill with familiar faces. Children would laugh. Farmers would walk toward the fields. The Nile would continue its endless journey north. And another peaceful chapter would quietly be added to the long, unhurried story of ancient Egypt. Part 18. The first golden rays of the morning sun slowly spread across the Nile Valley, touching the tops of the palm trees before reaching the fertile fields below. A gentle mist still floated above the river, moving so softly that it seemed almost weightless. From the distance came the quiet call of a fisherman greeting another as their boats drifted away from the shore. There was no urgency in their voices. The day had only just begun. There was plenty of time. One small boat carried an elderly fisherman named Mena. For more than 40 years, he had begun nearly every morning in exactly the same way. He untied the weathered rope from a wooden post. He placed his woven basket beneath the seat. He checked his carefully repaired net. Then he gently pushed the boat into the calm water. Every movement was familiar. Every action had become part of a peaceful morning ritual. His grandson, now old enough to join him, climbed aboard with careful excitement. The boy sat quietly for several moments, watching the shoreline slowly drift away. "Grandfather," he whispered, "have you ever become tired of seeing the Nile?" Mena smiled without turning around. "No," he answered softly, "because the river is never exactly the same." Boy looked across the water to him. It seemed unchanged. The same gentle current, the same reeds, the same birds flying overhead. Seeing the confusion on his grandson's face, Mena dipped his hand into the cool water. "Look carefully," he said. "The light is different every morning. The wind never blows in exactly the same way. Birds choose different places to land. The river always has something new to show those who are willing to notice." Boy remained silent. For the rest of the journey, he paid closer attention. He noticed tiny ripples spreading from a fish beneath the surface. He watched a kingfisher dive with remarkable speed before returning to a nearby branch. He observed how the morning sunlight changed from pale gold to brilliant white as the hours slowly passed. Perhaps his grandfather had been right. The river was never truly the same. Back in the village, smoke curled gently upward from dozens of clay ovens. The smell of fresh bread mixed with the sweet fragrance of blooming lotus flowers carried by the morning breeze. Women swept the packed earth outside their homes using simple reed brooms. Children carried small clay jars to collect water before the day grew warmer. A potter opened his kiln, smiling with quiet satisfaction as he inspected a row of perfectly fired storage jars. Not a single one had cracked. It would be a good day. Across the marketplace, merchants unfolded woven mats and carefully arranged their goods. Fresh vegetables, golden honey, bundles of papyrus, fine linen cloth, clay lamps, carved wooden bowls, everything found its familiar place. Regular customers greeted one another with warm smiles. Many had known each other for decades. Conversations began long before any trading took place. A traveler arriving from a distant town shared news about repairs being made to a canal farther south. Another described seeing large flocks of migratory birds gathering near the marshes. No one hurried him. Stories traveled at the speed of conversation. And that was more than enough. Nearby, a young apprentice scribe practiced writing on a smooth piece of limestone before using valuable papyrus. His teacher watched patiently. Every symbol had to be balanced. Every line needed confidence. When the boy made a mistake, the teacher simply nodded toward the stone. Again, there was no frustration, no raised voice. Only another opportunity to improve. That was how mastery was achieved in ancient Egypt, not through shortcuts, but through thousands of quiet repetitions. As the morning continued, life along the Nile settled into its familiar rhythm once again. Boats glided across the water, farmers walked toward their fields, children laughed beneath the shade of sycamore trees. The breeze carried the scent of fertile earth across the valley. Nothing extraordinary happened, and perhaps that was the greatest gift of all. Because civilizations are not built only by moments of greatness. They are built by ordinary mornings, by fresh bread shared with family, by careful hands repairing fishing nets, by patient teachers guiding eager students, by rivers that continue flowing, season after season, asking for nothing in return except respect. The Nile offered that lesson every single day, and the people of ancient Egypt with calm hearts and steady hands listened. Part 19. The morning gradually unfolded into another calm and beautiful day along the Nile. The mist that had covered the river at sunrise disappeared beneath the growing warmth of the Egyptian sun, revealing water as smooth as polished glass. Small fishing boats drifted quietly with the gentle current. Some relied on the river itself. Others raised square linen sails, allowing the dependable northern breeze to guide them upstream. It was one of the remarkable gifts of the Nile. The current carried boats north. The wind often carried them south. Nature itself seemed to understand the needs of those who lived beside its waters. Not far from the village, a narrow footpath led toward a peaceful grove of sycamore fig trees. Their broad branches offered cool shade that farmers appreciated during the warmer hours of the morning. One elderly man sat beneath the largest tree, slowly weaving a new basket from fresh papyrus reeds. Several children gathered nearby, fascinated by the steady movements of his hands. Without looking up, he smiled. "Every basket begins the same way," he said, "one reed at a time." Children watched closely. A single reed did not seem very important, neither did the second or the third. Yet as the old man patiently continued weaving, a strong basket gradually appeared. He paused for a moment before speaking again. "Life is much the same. Kind word, honest day's work, lesson, act of patience. None seem very important by themselves. Together, they build something strong." Children nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps they would fully understand those words many years later, perhaps not. But the lesson had quietly found a place in their memories. Nearby, a pair of oxen slowly pulled a wooden cart loaded with sacks of freshly harvested grain. The wheels creaked gently over the packed earth. Their pace was slow, steady, unchanging. No one urged the animals to move faster. The driver understood that reaching the granary safely mattered far more than arriving quickly. Throughout ancient Egypt, grain was carefully stored inside large community granaries. These buildings protected the harvest from moisture, insects, and hungry animals. More importantly, they helped communities prepare for years when the flood might not be as generous. Planning for the future was considered an act of wisdom, not fear. The people respected the abundance of good years by preparing for more difficult ones. As the cart disappeared into the village, the marketplace slowly filled with familiar sounds. The gentle conversation of neighbors greeting one another, the quiet tapping of a potter arranging freshly fired bowls, the rustle of linen cloth as merchants unfolded their goods, a child laughing while chasing a small white goat that had wandered away from its owner. Nothing about the morning felt hurried. Nothing felt loud. Even the busiest moments carried a peaceful rhythm. Farther downstream, a group of young apprentices worked beside an experienced boat builder. A large acacia log rested across wooden supports. Using copper tools, they carefully shaped its surface. One apprentice accidentally struck the wood too hard, leaving a small dent. He immediately looked disappointed. The master craftsman walked over slowly. He examined the mark for several seconds. Then he smiled. Wood teaches patience. He handed the young man a smoothing stone. Every mistake is simply another place where careful hands are needed. Apprentice relaxed. Together they patiently repaired the small imperfection. No lesson was wasted. Around midday, the fragrance of cooking drifted once again through the village. Flat loaves baked inside clay ovens. Lentils simmered slowly inside earthen pots. Fresh herbs were chopped with simple copper knives. Children returning from morning chores eagerly followed the wonderful aromas toward home. For many families, the midday meal became a peaceful pause before returning to the afternoon's work. They gathered beneath shaded courtyards where the breeze moved gently through woven reed screens. Conversations remained quiet. There was little need for excitement. The river flowed. The fields were healthy. The family was together. In many ways, that was enough. As the sun climbed higher into the cloudless sky, the Nile continued reflecting its brilliant light across the valley. Birds glided gracefully above the reeds. Lotus flowers slowly opened wider beneath the warmth. The current moved onward, just as it always had. Every ripple carried another moment of history downstream. Every gentle wave reminded the people of ancient Egypt that life's greatest strength often comes not from speed or power, but from patience, consistency, and quiet gratitude. And so, another peaceful morning slipped gently into another peaceful afternoon, adding one more ordinary, beautiful day to the endless story of the Nile. Part 20. By early afternoon, the Egyptian sun stood high above the fertile valley, casting a bright golden light over the winding Nile. The river sparkled quietly, its surface broken only by the gentle wake of passing boats and the occasional leap of a silver fish. Along the western bank, farmers finished their morning work and gathered beneath the cool shade of date palms and sycamore fig trees. There was no rush. The hottest hours of the day belonged to rest as much as they belonged to labor. One farmer carefully poured cool water from a clay jar into small cups for everyone nearby. The water had remained surprisingly fresh inside the thick earthen container despite the rising heat. Clay was one of ancient Egypt's simplest treasures. It became jars, bowls, ovens, and countless other everyday objects. Even without modern technology, people understood how to work with nature instead of against it. As they rested, the farmers spoke quietly about the coming flood season. No one knew exactly when the waters would begin to rise, but everyone trusted that the Nile would arrive in its own time. The flood was never seen as an enemy. It was welcomed like an old friend returning home. When the waters spread across the floodplain, they left behind a layer of rich black silt. This fertile soil allowed crops to flourish year after year. Without that annual gift, Egypt could never have supported its growing cities, magnificent temples, or countless villages. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus would later describe Egypt as the gift of the Nile. Thousands of years later, historians still repeat those words because they remain remarkably accurate. Meanwhile, farther down the river, a young boat captain carefully guided his wooden vessel through a narrow channel between patches of papyrus reeds. His cargo was modest: baskets of onions, jars of olive oil, bundles of fine linen. Nothing extraordinary. Yet every shipment mattered. Trade connected communities separated by many miles of river. Without these daily journeys, villages would have remained isolated. Instead, ideas, goods, and friendships traveled together along the Nile. On the eastern shore, Children gathered beneath a large acacia tree where an elderly storyteller often spent the warm afternoons. He never carried books. He didn't need them. Every story lived in his memory. Today he spoke about a traveler who had sailed from the Nile Delta all the way to the distant southern frontier. The tale described bustling harbors, towering temples, unfamiliar birds, and marketplaces filled with colorful goods from lands beyond Egypt. The children listened with wide eyes. For many of them, these stories were their first glimpse of places they might never see. Long before printed maps, stories became windows into the wider world. Nearby, a young apprentice carefully polished a small copper mirror. Unlike modern mirrors made of glass, Egyptian mirrors were crafted from highly polished metal. When finished properly, they reflected faces with surprising clarity. The apprentice smiled as sunlight shimmered across the smooth surface. His master inspected the work with quiet approval. "Good craftsmanship," he said softly, "is doing your best even when no one is watching." Lesson remained simple, but it stayed with the young apprentice for the rest of his life. As the afternoon breeze returned from the north, birds once again filled the sky. Graceful ibises searched the muddy shoreline. Kingfishers flashed brilliant blue as they dived toward the water. High above, hawks circled patiently, carried almost effortlessly by rising currents of warm air. Nature never seemed hurried. Every creature moved according to its own rhythm. The Egyptians admired that quiet confidence. They believed people, too, should live in harmony with the world around them. Toward the edge of the village, a family worked together repairing the roof of their mud brick home before the next flood season. Fresh layers of mud mixed with straw were carefully spread across the roof to strengthen it. Even children helped by carrying small baskets of straw. No task was considered too small. Every helping hand mattered. When the work was finished, the family stood back and smiled with quiet satisfaction. Their home was ready for another season. No celebration was needed. The work itself was enough. As the afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, the light became softer once again. The long shadows returned across the fields. Boats began making their way home. The scent of fresh bread drifted through the village for another evening meal. And the Nile, calm as always, continued its timeless journey, reminding every generation that history is not made only by kings and monuments, but by ordinary people living ordinary days with patience, kindness, and quiet purpose. Part 21. The afternoon slowly surrendered to evening once again. The bright Egyptian sun began its gentle descent toward the western desert, painting the cliffs with rich shades of gold, amber, and deep crimson. Across the Nile, the changing light transformed the river into a sheet of liquid bronze. Every ripple reflected the sky like a moving painting. The villagers hardly noticed. To them, this beautiful sight was simply another evening beside the Nile. Beauty had become part of everyday life. Along the riverbank, fishermen returned one by one. Some boats carried baskets filled with tilapia and catfish. Others held only a modest catch. Yet no one compared their success with another's. The river had provided what it wished to provide. Tomorrow would be another day. As the boats touched the shore, children hurried forward to help pull them onto the sand. The older fishermen smiled with quiet appreciation. Helping was never something that required asking twice. It was simply what neighbors did. Nearby, a young boy carefully untangled a fishing net while his grandfather watched. The old man did not immediately correct every mistake. Instead, he allowed the boy to discover the proper rhythm for himself. After several quiet minutes, the knots became smoother. The net began to take shape once again. "You see," the grandfather said gently, "hands learn best when patience teaches them." Boy nodded. He would remember those words long after the lesson itself had ended. A little farther inland, smoke curled upward from dozens of clay ovens. The wonderful smell of fresh bread drifted through every narrow lane of the village. Women stirred lentils inside large earthen pots while herbs, garlic, and onions slowly released their rich aromas into the cool evening air. Simple meals filled humble homes, yet they carried something priceless. The comfort of family gathered around a shared table. Across the marketplace, merchants packed away the day's remaining goods. Clay jars were stacked carefully beside woven baskets. Fine linen cloth was folded with great care before being placed inside wooden chests. Nothing valuable was left exposed overnight. Years of experience had taught everyone that careful habits save both time and resources. As the last customers departed, the square became wonderfully quiet. Only a few neighbors remained, sitting together beneath a large sycamore tree. They spoke softly about the coming harvest. One elderly farmer recalled the great flood of his childhood, when the Nile had risen higher than anyone expected. Another smiled as he remembered learning to steer a boat from his father many decades earlier. Stories passed easily from one generation to the next. No one interrupted. Listening was considered just as important as speaking. Farther down the river, a caravan arrived after several days crossing the eastern desert. Their donkeys carried bags of salt, polished stones, fragrant resins, and finely crafted wooden boxes. The travelers looked tired, but they smiled with relief as they finally reached the river. Fresh water was offered before any business began. Bread was shared before prices were discussed. Hospitality always came first. Trade could wait. The Nile had taught its people that generosity often returned many times over. As twilight deepened, white egrets settled among the papyrus reeds. The last swallows disappeared beneath the rooftops. Soon, bats silently replaced them in the evening sky. Nature changed shifts so smoothly that few people even noticed. The air grew cooler. Palm leaves whispered gently above the homes. Some families spread woven mats outside their doorways, choosing to spend the evening beneath the stars instead of indoors. Children pointed toward the first bright stars appearing overhead. An elderly grandmother smiled as she quietly named each familiar constellation she had learned from her own grandmother many years before. Knowledge flowed through families much like the Nile itself, never stopping, never rushing, always moving forward. In the distance, the silhouette of a temple stood peacefully against the darkening sky. Its tall stone columns had witnessed countless sunsets just like this one. Priests had come and gone. Kings had ruled and passed away. Entire generations had lived full lives beneath its shadow. Yet the temple remained. So did the river, as darkness gently covered the valley. The final colors faded from the horizon. Oil lamps began glowing inside the homes. Laughter softened into quiet conversation. The village settled into another peaceful evening, wrapped in the timeless rhythm of the Nile, a rhythm that had guided Egypt for thousands of years and would continue long after every voice in the village had become part of history. Part 22. The evening deepened slowly, almost as though the Nile itself wished to hold on to the final moments of daylight. The western horizon still glowed faintly with shades of orange and rose, while the eastern sky welcomed the first quiet stars of the night. A cool breeze drifted across the river, carrying with it the fresh scent of water and blooming lotus flowers. After the warmth of the day, the air felt wonderfully refreshing. Families remained outside a little longer before bedtime. Children sat beside their grandparents, listening to stories that had been told for generations. One elderly woman spoke about the Nile as though it were an old friend. "It has watched every family that has ever lived here," she said softly. "It has seen babies take their first steps. It has carried young couples across the river on their wedding day. It has reflected the faces of people who are now only memories. The river never forgets." Children listened quietly. The gentle sound of flowing water made the story feel almost real. Nearby, several young men repaired a small wooden dock that had loosened during the previous flood season. One held the timber steady. Another carefully tied fresh rope around the wooden posts. A third hammered wooden pegs into place with slow, steady strikes. No one rushed. Darkness was coming. If the work could not be finished tonight, tomorrow would be another opportunity. That simple understanding removed much of life's unnecessary pressure. Along the shoreline, fishermen prepared their lamps for another peaceful night on the water. Small clay bowls filled with oil cast a warm golden glow across the decks of their boats. The reflections shimmered gently upon the surface of the Nile, looking like tiny floating stars. The fishermen smiled quietly. They had seen this beautiful sight hundreds of times. Yet somehow, it never grew ordinary. Farther upstream, a temple musician quietly tuned a simple harp before an evening ceremony. The instrument was beautifully crafted from polished wood with carefully stretched strings. When the first gentle notes filled the night air, they blended naturally with the sounds of frogs, crickets, and the soft breeze moving through the papyrus reeds. There was no audience applauding, no grand performance, only peaceful music offered with gratitude. In another part of the village, a family gathered around an elderly grandfather who had spent many years as a scribe. His eyesight had weakened with age, but his memory remained remarkably clear. One of his grandchildren asked him why writing was so important. The old man smiled. Because memory can fade, words written with care can travel farther than any boat. He gently unrolled a sheet of papyrus. The writing had been completed many years earlier. It listed grain deliveries from a successful harvest. To anyone else, it might have seemed ordinary. To him, it was proof that everyday life deserved to be remembered. History was not made only by kings. It was made by farmers counting sacks of grain, boat builders measuring timber, mothers baking bread, children learning to write their first symbols. Every ordinary life added another page to Egypt's remarkable story. As the night grew darker, the moon slowly rose above the eastern horizon. Its silver light spread across the Nile, transforming the river into a shimmering ribbon that stretched toward the distant delta. Several boats drifted silently beneath the moonlight. From the shore, they appeared almost weightless. Only the gentle splash of an oar disturbed the silence. An owl called from the branches of a sycamore tree. Somewhere in the marshes, frogs answered with their familiar chorus. The village itself became quieter with every passing moment. Oil lamps were extinguished one by one. Doors remained open just enough to welcome the cool breeze. Children slept peacefully beneath linen blankets. Parents spoke softly before closing their eyes. Outside, the stars continued their ancient journey across the heavens. The river continued its endless journey toward the Mediterranean Sea. Neither hurried, neither paused. They simply continued just as they always had. And beneath that peaceful Egyptian sky, another ordinary evening quietly became another unforgettable moment in one of history's greatest civilizations. Part 23. The moon climbed higher into the night sky, bathing the Nile Valley in a soft silver glow. The great river seemed almost enchanted beneath the moonlight. Every gentle ripple carried shimmering reflections of the stars, while the tall papyrus reeds swayed quietly in the cool northern breeze. For anyone standing along the riverbank, time itself seemed to slow. The village rested peacefully. Most homes had extinguished their oil lamps. Only a few small lights remained, glowing faintly behind open doorways where families lingered in quiet conversation before sleep. A young mother gently rocked her baby while humming a melody her own mother had once sung to her. The tune was simple. There were no instruments, only a soft human voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the Nile. Long before written music existed, songs like these carried comfort from one generation to the next. Nearby, an elderly potter sat outside his workshop, looking at the stars. His hands, rough from decades of shaping clay, rested quietly in his lap. Tomorrow he would return to his wheel. Tomorrow more jars would take shape beneath his fingertips. But tonight there was nothing left to do. He simply watched the heavens. Sometimes the most meaningful moments required no work at all, only presence. Only gratitude. Along the shoreline, a lone fishing boat drifted slowly beneath the moon. The fisherman did not cast his net immediately. Instead, he listened. The soft splash of fish near the reeds, the whisper of water against the wooden hull, the distant call of a night bird echoing across the marshes. These familiar sounds told him more than hurried movement ever could. Experience had taught him that nature often speaks quietly. One only needed patience to hear it. Far across the valley, the massive pyramids stood beneath the stars. Their smooth limestone surfaces still reflected the moonlight with a pale glow, making them visible even from great distances. Travelers often described the sight as unforgettable. Yet the Egyptians themselves rarely viewed the pyramids as mysterious wonders. To them, they were simply part of the landscape, like the river, like the desert, like the sky. Generations had grown up with them always visible on the horizon. History often becomes ordinary for those living inside it. Near a temple courtyard, A young apprentice carefully swept the stone floor before sunrise preparations. Although the ceremony would not begin for many hours, he believed that careful preparation honored both the temple and the people who would gather there. His teacher had once told him something he never forgot. Great work is often invisible, happens before anyone arrives. The young apprentice repeated those words silently as he worked. Across another part of the village, an elderly woman repaired a woven reed mat by the light of a small oil lamp. The mat had served her family for many years. It would have been easier to throw it away and weave another, but nothing useful was discarded without reason. Every object represented someone's time, someone's effort, someone's skill. Respecting those things was part of respecting one another. The cool night air grew even quieter. Frogs continued their gentle chorus. Crickets answered from the grasses. Somewhere beyond the fields, a jackal called briefly before silence returned once more. The sounds were never frightening. They were simply reminders that the natural world remained awake while people rested. Slowly, the eastern horizon began to brighten ever so slightly. The darkest part of the night was passing. The stars nearest the horizon faded one after another. A faint silver glow appeared above the desert. Soon, another dawn would arrive. Another ordinary morning. Another day of baking bread, repairing boats, riding on papyrus, working the fields, teaching children, sharing meals, watching sunsets. Thousands of years later, historians would remember the pharaohs, the pyramids, and the magnificent temples. But the true heartbeat of ancient Egypt lived in mornings like these, in quiet villages, in gentle conversations, in patient hands, in simple acts of kindness repeated day after day. As the Nile continued flowing toward the sea, it carried with it another peaceful night, another quiet memory, and another timeless chapter in the extraordinary story of ancient Egypt. Part 24. A soft silver glow stretched across the eastern horizon as the final stars slowly disappeared into the coming dawn. For a brief moment, the Nile Valley rested between two worlds. The quiet mystery of night had not yet vanished. The busy rhythm of morning had not yet begun. It was one of the calmest moments of the entire day. A light mist floated above the river like a thin blanket, drifting lazily over the still water. Fishing boats remained tied to wooden posts along the shore, gently rocking with the current. Even the reeds seemed motionless. The world felt perfectly balanced. Then came the first sound. A single bird called from the branches of a date palm. Another answered from the opposite bank. Within minutes, dozens of voices joined together. Herons spread their broad wings over the marshes. Kingfishers flashed across the water like streaks of blue light. White ibises stepped carefully through the shallow mud in search of breakfast. The valley had awakened. Inside the village, the first cooking fires flickered back to life. Thin streams of smoke curled upward through the cool morning air. Soon the familiar aroma of baking bread drifted from nearly every home. To the people of ancient Egypt, few scents were more comforting. It marked the beginning of another peaceful day. An elderly woman named Merit carefully kneaded fresh dough inside a large clay bowl while her granddaughter measured grain beside her. The little girl frowned. "Grandmother," she asked, "how do you always know how much flour to use?" Merit smiled without stopping her work. "My hands remember." Child looked puzzled. The old woman laughed softly. "When you do something with care for many years, your hands begin to remember what your mind no longer needs to count." The little girl quietly watched every movement. One day her own hands would remember too. Across the village, farmers slowly gathered their tools before walking toward the fields. Wooden hoes rested across their shoulders. Oxen waited patiently beside simple wooden plows. No one hurried the animals. No one shouted. The work would begin soon enough. The Nile had already taught everyone that the strongest things in life moved steadily, not quickly. Along one irrigation canal, two brothers inspected the earthen banks built during the previous season. A few small cracks had appeared after months beneath the hot Egyptian sun. Without saying much, they mixed fresh mud with chopped straw and carefully repaired each section. It was quiet work. No audience watched. No reward would be given. Yet they understood something important. The smallest repairs prevented the biggest problems. A canal ignored today might fail during tomorrow's flood. Care given early often saved much greater effort later. Meanwhile, A young scribe arrived at the village granary carrying fresh sheets of papyrus. His task was simple. He would record how much grain entered and left the storage building each day. To many people, the work sounded repetitive. To him, it was meaningful. Every number represented a family. Every record protected the community. Careful writing was another form of service. Nearby, merchants slowly prepared their boats for another journey along the Nile. Bundles of linen were tied securely with flax rope. Large jars of olive oil were packed carefully between baskets of vegetables. Clay seals were pressed onto containers to show ownership before departure. The river connected hundreds of communities. Without it, trade would have been far slower and far more difficult. Every boat carried more than goods. It carried news, friendships, ideas, stories. As the sun climbed higher, children finished their morning chores and gathered beneath the shade of a large sycamore tree. An old storyteller greeted them with a warm smile. Today's story was not about kings or battles. It was about a humble gardener who patiently planted date palms, knowing he would never live long enough to enjoy their tallest shade. Why did he plant them? One boy asked. The old man looked toward the towering palms surrounding the village. Because someone before him planted trees for him. Children became quiet. Even at a young age, they understood the lesson. The greatest gifts are often given to people we may never meet. As the gentle breeze moved once again across the fertile valley, palm leaves rustled softly overhead. The Nile shimmered beneath the growing sunlight. Boats drifted peacefully along its timeless waters. Another ordinary morning unfolded exactly as countless mornings had before. And somewhere within its quiet rhythm, another generation quietly learned that greatness is rarely found in moments of noise. It is found in patience, in kindness, in careful work, and in living each ordinary day with gratitude beside the eternal Nile. Part 25. The morning slowly matured into another peaceful day along the Nile. The golden light that had welcomed the sunrise now bathed the fertile valley with a gentle warmth. Palm trees swayed softly in the northern breeze, and the river reflected the cloudless Egyptian sky with remarkable clarity. From a distance, everything appeared calm. Yet beneath that quiet surface, thousands of ordinary lives were working together, each playing a small part in sustaining one of history's greatest civilizations. Along a narrow canal, a farmer named Nebamun paused beside a patch of young wheat. He crouched quietly and picked up a handful of rich black soil. Rolling it gently between his fingers, he smiled. The earth still held just the right amount of moisture from the last irrigation. He did not need complicated instruments. Years of experience had taught him how healthy soil should feel. His youngest daughter watched with curiosity. "The ground really tell you if the plants are happy?" she asked. Nebamun laughed softly. "In a way, yes. The earth speaks. The plants answer. We simply learn to listen." The little girl pressed her own hand into the soil. It felt cool despite the growing warmth of the day. She smiled, believing she had heard the earth's quiet voice too. Nearby, a flock of white egrets wandered slowly across the freshly watered fields. With careful steps, they searched for insects stirred by the farmer's work. The birds had learned that people and nature could help one another without even trying. Neither seemed disturbed by the other's presence. It was another quiet partnership shaped over countless generations. Back in the village, the potter's workshop had become busy once again. Fresh clay, collected from the Nile's muddy banks, rested beneath damp cloth to keep it soft. A young apprentice carefully centered a lump of clay on the spinning wheel. His first attempt leaned slightly to one side. The master potter gently steadied the wheel. "Do not force the clay," he said. "Guide it." Apprentice slowed his hands. Almost immediately, the vessel became balanced. The lesson extended far beyond pottery. Many things in life responded better to patience than to pressure. Across the marketplace, merchants welcomed travelers arriving from villages farther north. A spice trader carefully opened small linen bags filled with fragrant coriander, cumin, and dried herbs. A carpenter displayed beautifully carved stools and wooden boxes. A jeweler arranged necklaces made from colorful faience beads that shimmered beneath the morning sunlight. Although the market bustled with activity, no one seemed rushed. Business was conducted with conversation first. Transactions came second. Trust was considered every bit as valuable as silver. Near the edge of the village, a teacher gathered several children beneath the wide branches of an ancient sycamore tree. Instead of beginning with writing, he pointed toward the river. "What do you see?" he asked. One child answered, "Water." Another replied, "Boats." A third said, "Fish." Teacher smiled. "Look again." They watched quietly. After several moments, one little girl whispered, "I see the river helping everyone." Teacher nodded. "Exactly. The Nile teaches without speaking. It gives, it carries, it nourishes. It asks only that we respect it." Sometimes the greatest lessons came not from books or scrolls, but from simply paying attention to the world around them. As midday approached, the village settled into its familiar rhythm. The smell of warm bread drifted once more from clay ovens. Children carried baskets of vegetables toward their homes. Boats glided silently across the water, their linen sails catching the dependable northern wind. Farmers paused beneath shaded trees to drink cool water stored in earthen jars. The air remained peaceful. The conversations remained gentle. No one seemed concerned with hurrying toward tomorrow. For the people of ancient Egypt, today deserved their full attention. And perhaps that was their greatest wisdom, not merely building monuments that would endure for thousands of years, but building ordinary days filled with patience, gratitude, honest work, and quiet joy. As the Nile continued its endless journey toward the Mediterranean Sea, it carried another beautiful morning into history, a morning that seemed ordinary at the time, yet would become one more timeless thread woven into the remarkable story of ancient Egypt. Part 26. The warmth of midday settled gently across the Nile Valley. The brilliant blue sky stretched endlessly above the fertile fields, untouched by clouds. The river reflected the sunlight so brightly that passing boats appeared to glide across sheets of liquid gold. Even the desert beyond the green floodplain shimmered softly in the distance. Yet despite the growing heat, life continued with its familiar, unhurried rhythm. The people of ancient Egypt had learned long ago that the sun was not something to fight. It was something to understand. Farmers slowed their pace. Craftsmen moved their work beneath shaded courtyards. Children gathered beneath wide sycamore trees where cool breezes still reached the ground. Nature quietly set the schedule. Everyone simply followed it. Along one irrigation canal, a young farmer named Kam paused beside an elderly neighbor who was repairing a small break in the earthen bank. Without saying a word, Kam picked up another basket of wet mud and began helping. The older man smiled. "I didn't ask." "You didn't have to," Kam replied. The repair took less than an hour. When they finished, fresh water once again flowed smoothly toward the waiting fields. Neither man expected payment. Helping one another had become part of everyday life. The Nile itself depended upon connected canals. The people understood that communities worked much the same way. Nearby, several women spread freshly washed linen across smooth river stones to dry beneath the brilliant Egyptian sun. The white fabric fluttered gently in the breeze. Children laughed as they tried to catch the shadows dancing across the ground. One little girl carefully folded a finished cloth exactly as her mother had shown her, not perfectly, but carefully. Her mother smiled with quiet pride. Skills were never inherited, they were patiently practiced. Across the village marketplace, a merchant carefully measured grain using stone weights that had been tested countless times. Fair trade mattered deeply. A dishonest measurement might bring profit for a single day. Honesty brought customers for many years. Reputation traveled quickly along the Nile. A trustworthy merchant was welcomed everywhere. An untrustworthy one soon found himself trading alone. Farther down the river, a small group of stonecutters rested beneath the shade of an unfinished monument. Their work was demanding. Each limestone block weighed far more than a single person could lift. Yet they rarely spoke about strength. Instead, they spoke about teamwork. One worker carefully explained to a young apprentice how ropes, wooden sledges, water, and many steady hands accomplished what no individual could ever do alone. The apprentice listened closely. He had imagined that great monuments were built by extraordinary people. Now he realized they were built by ordinary people working together, day after day, year after year. That realization filled him with quiet respect. As the afternoon breeze strengthened, several sailing boats appeared on the horizon. Their square linen sails caught the dependable northern wind, allowing them to travel south, while the river's current naturally carried other boats north. Few ancient civilizations enjoyed such a remarkable natural transportation system. The Nile and the wind worked together like silent partners. Merchants often said the river carried their boats one way. The breeze kindly brought them home. Near the village school, a young scribe practiced writing numbers instead of words. His teacher reminded him that mathematics was just as important as beautiful handwriting. Without careful counting, grain could not be stored correctly, taxes could not be recorded fairly, construction could not be planned accurately. Behind every magnificent temple stood someone quietly solving practical problems. History remembered the finished monuments. It rarely remembered the patient calculations that made them possible. Toward late afternoon, the heat slowly began to soften. Long shadows stretched once more across the fields. Birdsong returned as flocks of swallows skimmed gracefully above the river, catching insects that danced in the warm air. The scent of baking bread drifted once again from village ovens. Families slowly made their way home. Children carried small bundles of firewood. Farmers placed their tools beside the doorway, knowing tomorrow would bring another sunrise and another opportunity to continue their work. Nothing about the day had been extraordinary. No king had visited. No great battle had been fought. No monument had been completed. Yet this quiet afternoon mattered just as much. Because civilizations are not sustained by rare moments of glory alone. They are sustained by ordinary people who wake each morning, help one another, care for their families, respect the land, and trust the steady rhythm of the river. And as always, the timeless Nile continued flowing north, carrying another peaceful day gently into history. Part 27. As the afternoon slowly melted into evening, the fierce brightness of the Egyptian sun softened into a warm golden glow. The fertile fields beside the Nile shimmered gently in the fading light, while the distant desert hills turned shades of copper, amber, and deep crimson. It was the hour when work naturally came to an end, not because someone announced it, but because nature quietly signaled that it was time. Farmers rested their wooden hoes against the walls of their homes. Boatmen tied their vessels securely to the riverbank. Craftsmen carefully placed their tools back into woven baskets. Each task ended with the same care that had begun it. Nothing was simply dropped or forgotten. Respect for work included respecting the tools that made it possible. Near the edge of the village, a young carpenter named Painesi carefully sharpened his copper chisel using a smooth sandstone block. His apprentice watched patiently. "Master," the boy asked, "why sharpen it every evening?" Painesi smiled. "So tomorrow begins easily." He gently tested the edge with his thumb. "A little care today saves much effort tomorrow." Apprentice quietly nodded. The lesson reached far beyond woodworking. Many of life's greatest successes began with small preparations made long before they were needed. Along the riverbank, fishermen gathered around a wooden pier, cleaning their nets after another day on the water. Tiny pieces of reed and river grass had become tangled among the flax fibers. One by one, they removed each strand. No one ignored the small repairs. A single broken knot could mean losing tomorrow's catch. Patience always paid better than haste. Nearby, children skipped smooth stones across the calm water. Each splash created circles that slowly expanded before disappearing into the quiet current. An elderly grandmother watched them from beneath a date palm. She smiled as one little boy celebrated after his stone bounced 5 times before sinking. She remembered doing the very same thing when she was his age. Different children, different century. The same laughter, the same river. Some things never truly changed. The marketplace gradually emptied as merchants packed away their goods. Clay jars were covered with woven lids. Baskets of figs and dates were carried indoors. Fine linen was folded carefully to protect it from the cool night air. Before leaving, neighboring merchants wished one another a peaceful evening. Competition rarely overshadowed friendship. Tomorrow would bring another market day. There was no reason to hurry. Farther downstream, a shepherd slowly guided his flock toward a simple enclosure built from mud, brick, and woven reeds. The sheep moved quietly, following familiar paths they had walked many times before. A loyal dog circled patiently around the edges of the flock, making sure none wandered away. Even the animals seemed to understand the gentle rhythm of evening. The breeze grew cooler. The smell of warm bread drifted through every narrow street. Families began gathering for supper. Mothers arranged simple meals on low wooden tables: fresh bread, lentil stew, cucumbers, onions, dates. Sometimes grilled fish caught only hours earlier from the Nile. Nothing extravagant, everything appreciated. Across the valley, the setting sun reflected brilliantly against the smooth limestone casing stones that still covered many of the pyramids. For a few breathtaking minutes, the monuments seemed almost to glow with their own light. Travelers often paused in amazement at the sight, yet nearby villagers rarely stopped to admire them. To them, the pyramids were simply part of the familiar horizon. History often feels ordinary to those living inside it. As twilight slowly spread across the land, the first evening birds returned to their nests. Swallows disappeared beneath the roofs. Ibises settled among the papyrus reeds. Soon, the quiet songs of crickets and frogs replaced the cheerful sounds of daytime birds. The entire valley changed its rhythm without confusion, without noise, without hurry. Nature always knew exactly what came next. The people had learned to trust that rhythm. As darkness gently approached, another peaceful day quietly reached its end. No great celebration marked its passing. No trumpet announced its importance. Yet somewhere, another loaf of bread had been baked. Another child had learned a valuable lesson. Another boat had returned safely home. Another family had shared a meal together. These ordinary moments, repeated thousands upon thousands of times, quietly built one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. And through it all, the Nile flowed on, steady, patient, and timeless, carrying another beautiful evening into the endless story of ancient Egypt. Part 28. Night settled gently over the Nile Valley like a soft linen blanket. The last traces of daylight disappeared beyond the western desert, leaving behind a sky filled with countless brilliant stars. Without the glow of modern cities, the heavens appeared almost unbelievably bright. The Milky Way stretched from one horizon to the other like a silver river flowing above the river below. For the people of ancient Egypt, the sky was as familiar as the land itself. Children often learned the stars long before they could read. An elderly grandfather pointed toward a bright star rising in the east. "When I was your age," he said with a quiet smile, "my grandfather showed me that same star." The little boy looked up in amazement. "It hasn't moved," the old man chuckled softly. "It moves every night. It always returns. There is comfort in things that remain faithful." Boy continued watching until the star climbed higher into the darkness. Nearby, families gathered outside their homes to enjoy the cool evening air. The thick mud brick walls had protected them from the daytime heat, but now the breeze flowing along the Nile made the night wonderfully comfortable. Neighbors shared simple conversations. Some spoke about tomorrow's work. Others remembered stories from years gone by. Many simply enjoyed sitting together without saying very much at all. Silence was never awkward. It was peaceful. Across the village, an elderly woman carefully lit a small oil lamp. Its flame flickered gently, casting warm golden light across the room. She sat beside her loom, weaving the final rows of a linen cloth she had begun several days earlier. Every thread crossed another with quiet precision. The steady rhythm of the loom created a soothing sound that blended perfectly with the peaceful night outside. She knew she would not finish tonight. There was no disappointment. Tomorrow would arrive soon enough. Farther down the river, several fishermen drifted quietly beneath the moonlight. The Nile looked almost magical. Silver reflections danced across the gentle current each time a fish disturbed the surface. One fisherman lowered his net with slow, careful movements. His son watched closely. "Do you know where to cast it?" the boy whispered. His father smiled. "River tells us. Birds tell us. The wind tells us. Sometimes we simply wait." Patience once again proved to be one of the greatest teachers beside the Nile. Near the temple, a young apprentice priest climbed to the rooftop observatory carrying a small bundle of papyrus scrolls. His teacher was already waiting. Together they quietly observed the stars, recording their positions with remarkable care. Long before telescopes, the Egyptians noticed repeating patterns in the heavens. Their careful observations helped shape calendars, religious festivals, and farming seasons. Knowledge grew slowly, one clear night at a time, one careful observation after another. Back in the village, children had begun falling asleep. Parents covered them gently with soft linen blankets. The laughter that had filled the streets only an hour earlier slowly faded into peaceful silence. A dog stretched comfortably beside the doorway. A cat wandered quietly through the courtyard before curling into a warm corner. The sounds of the night became softer, the gentle chorus of frogs, the whisper of reeds moving in the breeze, the endless murmur of the Nile flowing toward the distant sea. Above everything stood the timeless pyramids, glowing faintly beneath the moon. For generations they had watched over Egypt. Kings had come and gone, dynasties had risen and fallen, yet the pyramids remained, not because they were invincible, but because thousands of ordinary workers had placed one stone upon another with extraordinary patience. History often remembers the finished monument. It rarely remembers the countless quiet hands that built it. As midnight slowly approached, the village rested completely. Oil lamps were extinguished one by one. Only the moon remained, reflecting softly upon the endless waters of the Nile. The river never paused. It never hurried. It simply continued its gentle journey northward, carrying another peaceful night through the heart of ancient Egypt, just as it had for thousands of years, and just as it would for thousands more. Part 29. Long before the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon, the Nile Valley rested in complete silence. The air had become pleasantly cool. A gentle mist hovered above the river, drifting slowly between clusters of papyrus reeds like a thin white veil. The moon hung low in the western sky, its reflection stretching across the calm water in a shimmering silver path. Everything seemed perfectly still. Yet beneath that quietness, life continued. Fish moved silently beneath the surface. Owls glided through the darkness without a sound. Tiny insects hovered above the marshes. The river flowed steadily toward the distant Mediterranean, never pausing, never rushing. It had followed this path for countless centuries, and it would continue long after every generation living beside it had become part of history. Along the riverbank, an elderly watchman slowly completed his nightly rounds. He carried nothing more than a wooden staff and a small oil lamp whose flame flickered gently in the cool breeze. He paused beside each dock, making certain every boat remained safely tied. He listened carefully, the quiet splash of water against wood, the rustling of reeds, the distant croak of frogs hidden among the marshes. Nothing unusual disturbed the peaceful night. He smiled softly. A quiet night was always the best kind. Not far away, inside a modest mud brick home, an elderly baker had already awakened. Without making a sound, he knelt beside yesterday's oven. Beneath a layer of cool ashes, he found several glowing embers that had survived the night. Carefully adding dry reeds and small pieces of wood, he gently breathed life back into the fire. Within minutes, warm orange flames danced once again inside the clay oven. The first bread of the new day would soon begin to bake. His grandson quietly entered the room, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Grandfather," he whispered, "why do you wake before everyone else?" The old baker smiled while kneading fresh dough. "Because bread should be ready before hunger arrives." Boy nodded thoughtfully. Simple wisdom often carried the deepest meaning. Outside, the eastern horizon slowly changed from deep black to dark blue. Then came a thin ribbon of pale silver. The stars nearest the horizon quietly faded. One by one, birds hidden among the palm trees began greeting the coming morning. Their cheerful song spread naturally across the valley. There was no conductor, no signal, only nature following its timeless rhythm. Nearby, fishermen stepped quietly into their boats. Morning remained their favorite time to cast their nets. The water was calm. The breeze was gentle. The world still felt wonderfully peaceful. One young fisherman looked toward the sky and noticed the bright planet Venus shining just before sunrise. His father smiled. "My grandfather called it the morning lantern. It reminds us that dawn is never far away." Young man continued watching until the growing sunlight slowly erased the bright point from the sky. Along the edge of the village, Several women gathered fresh water from the Nile using smooth clay jars. Their reflections shimmered softly upon the river before breaking apart with each gentle ripple. Children followed closely behind, carrying smaller jars of their own. No one complained about the chore. Collecting water was simply another part of daily life, and the walk to the river often became one of the most peaceful moments of the morning. As sunlight finally touched the tops of the palm trees, the entire valley awakened. Smoke curled upward from dozens of clay ovens. Fresh bread filled the air with its comforting aroma. Oxen patiently waited beside wooden plows. Boats gently pushed away from the shore. Merchants began arranging goods beneath woven market stalls. The ordinary miracle of another day had begun. Nothing spectacular announced its arrival. There were no trumpets, no ceremonies. Only the quiet certainty that life, once again, would continue. The Nile offered fresh water. The fertile soil offered food. Families offered kindness to one another. And together, these simple gifts built a civilization that would inspire the world for thousands of years. As the golden sunlight spread across the river, another peaceful morning became another timeless page in the endless story of ancient Egypt. Part 30. The first full light of morning spread gently across the Nile Valley, bathing the fields in a warm golden glow. Tiny drops of dew sparkled on blades of grass and papyrus reeds before slowly disappearing beneath the rising sun. The river reflected the colors of the sky so perfectly that it became difficult to tell where the water ended and the heavens began. Another ordinary day had arrived, and like thousands before it, it began quietly. A flock of white ibises lifted gracefully from the marshes, their broad wings catching the morning light. Nearby, kingfishers darted across the river with flashes of brilliant blue, diving into the water before returning triumphantly to overhanging branches. The people of ancient Egypt rarely hurried past such sights. They had learned that nature always had something worth noticing. On a small farm just outside the village, a young boy named Amos followed his mother through a vegetable garden. Rows of onions, lettuce, leeks, beans, and cucumbers stretched neatly across the rich black soil left behind by the Nile's annual flood. His mother knelt beside a young cucumber plant. She gently removed several small weeds growing nearby. "Why not pull everything?" Amos asked. She smiled. "Because not everything growing is our enemy." She pointed toward a flowering plant where bees moved quietly from blossom to blossom. "Some plants feed the insects. The insects help the garden feeds us. Everything is connected." Boy remained silent, carefully watching the bees continue their work. It was another lesson the Nile offered without speaking. Not far away, a potter loaded freshly shaped bowls into a clay kiln. Each piece had dried for several days before reaching this stage. If fired too soon, the pottery might crack. If left too long, the clay could become brittle. Success depended upon timing. The potter often told his apprentices, "Patience is part of the craft. You cannot rush the fire." Across the village marketplace, the first merchants welcomed travelers arriving by boat. One vessel carried woven baskets filled with fragrant dates from the south. Another transported beautifully carved wooden furniture crafted by skilled artisans farther upstream. A third brought bundles of papyrus ready to become scrolls for scribes and temple records. Trade along the Nile was more than the exchange of goods. It was the exchange of ideas, traditions, and friendships. News traveled with every boat. So did laughter. So did stories. Near the temple school, a group of young students practiced writing hieroglyphs upon smooth limestone flakes. Papyrus remained too valuable for beginners. Their teacher walked slowly among them, offering gentle corrections. One student sighed after making the same mistake several times. The teacher smiled kindly. "Stone is patient. You may try again." Simple words removed the boy's frustration. Soon, his writing became steadier, better. Sometimes encouragement accomplished more than criticism ever could. As the sun climbed higher, the village settled into the comforting rhythm of daily life. A carpenter measured cedar wood with remarkable precision before shaping it into a storage chest. A weaver worked patiently at her loom, creating fine linen cloth thread by thread. Children carried baskets of figs to the market while laughing together beneath the shade of tall sycamore trees. the air filled with familiar sounds. The gentle creak of wooden water wheels lifting water into irrigation canals, the distant call of herons along the riverbank, the rhythmic tapping of craftsmen shaping stone and wood. None of these sounds felt noisy. Together they formed the peaceful heartbeat of the valley. Looking across the fertile landscape, it became clear why ancient Egypt endured for so many centuries. Its strength did not come only from powerful pharaohs or magnificent monuments. It came from ordinary people who believed every task mattered. A farmer caring for a single field, a baker preparing tomorrow's bread, a scribe recording today's harvest, a child learning to write, a family sharing an evening meal. These quiet moments rarely appeared on temple walls, yet they were the true foundation of Egyptian civilization. And while generations would rise and fall, while rulers would come and go, the Nile would continue its faithful journey, bringing life, peace, and quiet hope to every new dawn that unfolded along its timeless shores. Part 31. By the time the morning reached its fullest brightness, the Nile Valley was alive with quiet purpose. Golden sunlight shimmered across the broad river, while gentle waves lapped against the banks with the same steady rhythm they had followed for thousands of years. The breeze carried the fresh scent of wet earth, flowering lotus, and newly cut reeds. Nothing about the day felt extraordinary, yet every ordinary moment carried the quiet strength that had allowed Egypt to flourish for centuries. Along a peaceful canal, an elderly gardener named Beck carefully tended a grove of date palms. Some of the tallest trees had been planted by his grandfather, others by his father. The youngest had been planted by Beck himself only a few years earlier. His grandson looked up at the towering palms. "Grandfather," he asked, "will these trees still be here when I am old?" Beck rested his hand against the rough trunk of the nearest palm. "If they are cared for," he replied, "they may still be standing when your grandchildren ask you the very same question." Boy smiled. For the first time, he understood that planting a tree was a gift for people he might never meet. Not far away, a group of women harvested ripe flax from a nearby field. The long blue flowers had already faded, leaving behind strong fibers that would become linen. They worked slowly, gathering the stalks into neat bundles before laying them in the sun to dry. One young woman asked her mother, "How can something so rough become cloth so soft?" Her mother laughed gently. "Time, water, care, patient hands." Daughter nodded. She realized those same four things improved many parts of life. At the village docks, merchants prepared for another journey north toward the Nile Delta. Crew members checked every rope before departure. Clay jars filled with olive oil were carefully secured beneath woven mats. Bundles of papyrus were stacked beside baskets of figs, onions, and barley. Nothing was loaded carelessly. A boat captain once said, "The river forgives many things. It never forgives carelessness." His crew remembered those words every time they sailed. Farther inland, a master stone mason guided several apprentices through the construction of a small shrine. Rather than lifting heavy blocks himself, he spent most of the morning teaching. He showed them how to examine each stone before placing it, how to recognize tiny cracks, how to smooth rough edges, how to make each block fit naturally against the next. "Stone remembers every mistake," he said quietly, "so build with patience." Young workers listened closely. Centuries later, historians would admire the finished buildings. Very few would ever know the names of the craftsmen who shaped them, yet their careful work would outlive them all. Near the marketplace, children gathered around a traveling storyteller who had arrived from a village several days upstream. He spoke about distant temples, colorful festivals, and wide marshes where thousands of birds gathered during the changing seasons. The children listened with wide eyes. For a little while, the entire Nile became larger than their own village. Stories carried people across great distances long before maps or books became common. By midday, the warm sun encouraged many workers to rest beneath shaded trees. Clay jars of cool water were passed from hand to hand. Fresh bread was shared. So were dates, cucumbers, and small pieces of salty cheese. No one hurried through the meal. Conversation flowed gently. Someone spoke about repairing a canal after the next flood. Another remembered a childhood fishing trip with his father. A grandmother laughed as she watched two toddlers chase butterflies through the grass. The smallest moments often became the memories people treasured most. As the afternoon breeze returned from the north, the sails of passing boats filled once again. The river sparkled beneath the bright sky. Birds glided effortlessly above the reeds. The fields stretched endlessly in shades of green and gold. Another peaceful day unfolded exactly as nature intended. And once again, the people of ancient Egypt quietly demonstrated a truth that still speaks to us today. A remarkable civilization is not built in a single generation. It is built one sunrise at a time, one family at a time, one act of kindness at a time, flowing forward patiently, just like the eternal Nile. Part 32, the afternoon sunlight settled gently across the Nile Valley, wrapping the fields in a warm blanket of gold. A light breeze drifted in from the north, causing the papyrus reeds to sway gracefully along the riverbanks. The surface of the Nile shimmered beneath the sun, carrying boats silently between villages that had depended upon its waters for countless generations. To an outsider, everything might have appeared unchanged, but to the people who lived here, every day carried its own quiet story. On the outskirts of one village, an elderly beekeeper named Intef carefully approached several clay beehives arranged beneath the shade of acacia trees. The bees moved calmly around him, undisturbed by his gentle presence. His granddaughter stood beside him, watching with fascination. "Weren't you ever afraid of them?" she asked. Intef smiled. "Only when I forgot to respect them." He carefully lifted a clay cover just enough to inspect the hive. The bees work together. They never waste what they gather. They prepare today for seasons they cannot yet see. The little girl watched thousands of tiny workers moving with remarkable order. Without realizing it, she was witnessing one of nature's oldest lessons about cooperation and patience. Nearby, several women carefully gathered ripe figs from an ancient orchard. The trees bent gently beneath the weight of their fruit. Rather than shaking the branches, they picked each fig by hand. Bruised fruit spoiled quickly in the Egyptian heat. Careful harvesting meant less waste. One woman handed a perfectly ripe fig to a young child. He took one bite and smiled. Its sweetness needed no explanation. Farther downstream, a merchant's boat stopped briefly at a riverside village. The captain greeted everyone by name before unloading baskets of barley, jars of olive oil, and rolls of fine linen. In return, local farmers loaded fresh vegetables, honey, and woven reed baskets onto the vessel. No written contracts were exchanged. Years of honesty had built something stronger than paper trust. The captain often said, "A good name travels farther than any boat." And along the Nile, reputation truly was one of a person's greatest treasures. Near the temple gardens, a young apprentice carefully watered rows of medicinal herbs, mint, coriander, fenugreek, chamomile. The temple healers relied upon these plants to prepare remedies for common illnesses. The apprentice knew every plant by sight. His teacher reminded, "You can help people. You must first understand the plants." Knowledge, like every garden, required patient care. At the edge of the marketplace, a group of musicians rested beneath a sycamore tree after performing during a small village celebration. One carried a wooden flute, another gently tuned a harp, a third held a simple hand drum. No audience remained. Still, one musician quietly began playing a peaceful melody simply because the evening breeze seemed to invite it. The notes floated gently across the marketplace, blending with birdsong and the soft whisper of the river. No applause followed. None was needed. Sometimes beauty existed simply to be enjoyed. As the afternoon slowly cooled, children wandered toward the riverbank with their parents. Some searched for smooth stones. Others watched turtles resting upon sunlit rocks. A father pointed toward a crocodile resting quietly on a distant sandbank. The children observed from a safe distance. "Even powerful creatures deserve respect," he explained calmly. "They belong to the river too." Lesson was not about fear, it was about balance. The Nile provided life to many creatures, not only to people. Toward sunset, the sky slowly transformed once again. Golden light became amber, amber softened into crimson. The western desert glowed brilliantly before fading into purple shadows. One by one, boats returned home. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the village. Oil lamps waited to be lit. families gathered together once more. Another peaceful day was drawing to a close. Nothing extraordinary had happened. No great battle had been won. No mighty king had issued a famous decree. Yet somewhere, a child had learned patience from a beekeeper. A gardener had cared for healing herbs. A merchant had strengthened friendships through honesty. A musician had filled the evening with quiet joy. And together, these simple moments became the true story of ancient Egypt, not merely a civilization of monuments, but a civilization of people who understood that the greatest legacy is built through countless ordinary days, lived with wisdom, compassion, and gratitude beside the eternal Nile. Part 33. As the final rays of sunlight slipped behind the western cliffs, the Nile Valley welcomed another peaceful evening. The brilliant colors of the day slowly softened into shades of amber, violet, and deep blue. The warm desert air cooled with surprising speed, and a gentle breeze drifted northward along the river, carrying the sweet fragrance of lotus blossoms and damp earth. For the people of ancient Egypt, evening was not simply the end of work. It was the beginning of togetherness. Along the narrow streets of the village, families slowly returned home. Farmers brushed the dust from their linen garments before stepping through their doorways. Boatmen secured their vessels with carefully tied flax ropes. Craftsmen placed their tools neatly on wooden shelves, knowing they would greet them again at sunrise. Every task ended with care. Nothing was abandoned in haste. Near a quiet courtyard, an elderly woman named Hinat spread woven mats across the ground for the evening meal. Her grandchildren eagerly helped carry clay bowls filled with lentils, fresh bread, roasted onions, cucumbers, and sweet dates. The youngest child asked, "Grandmother, why do we always eat together?" Hinat smiled as she broke a warm loaf of bread into equal pieces. Because food feeds the body, sharing feeds the heart. No one spoke for several moments. The family simply enjoyed the peaceful meal while listening to the soft sounds of the evening. Across the village square, an old storyteller settled beneath the broad branches of a sycamore fig tree. People of every age gathered nearby. He did not speak of wars. He did not speak of powerful rulers. Instead, he told the story of an unknown ferryman who had spent his entire life helping strangers cross the Nile safely. He never became famous, the storyteller said. No temple was built in his honor. Because of his kindness, thousands of people reached home. Listeners remained quiet. Everyone understood the lesson. History remembers great names. Life remembers good people. Farther downstream, fishermen prepared for another peaceful night upon the river. They checked each knot in their nets by the light of small oil lamps. One young fisherman became impatient while repairing a torn section. His father gently placed a hand upon his shoulder. "Fish will still be here tomorrow. A careless net may not." Together, they repaired every strand before launching their small boat into the moonlit water. Patience once again proved more valuable than speed. Nearby, several temple musicians gathered inside a stone courtyard. A harp, a wooden flute, and a softly played drum blended into a slow melody that floated across the quiet village. The music did not demand attention. It simply became part of the evening, mixing naturally with the whisper of palm leaves and the endless murmur of the Nile. As darkness settled over the valley, countless stars appeared overhead. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like another river flowing above Egypt. Children lay upon woven mats, searching for familiar constellations their grandparents had taught them to recognize. Every season brought new patterns. Every year the stars returned faithfully. They reminded everyone that while people grew older, the rhythms of nature continued. Near the riverbank, a young apprentice scribe sat beside his teacher. Instead of practicing hieroglyphs, they simply watched the moon reflected upon the Nile. After several quiet minutes, the teacher spoke. "You spend many days learning to write. Never forget to spend time learning to observe. Good scribe records what happens. Wise scribe understands why it matters." Young apprentice looked once more at the calm river. He realized that the Nile had been teaching lessons long before anyone had written them down. As the village gradually fell asleep, oil lamps disappeared one by one. The voices of neighbors faded into silence. Only the gentle sounds of frogs, crickets, and flowing water remained. The pyramid stood quietly beneath the stars. The temples rested peacefully in the moonlight. The fertile fields waited for another sunrise, and the Nile continued its endless journey, steady, generous, and unchanged, carrying yet another tranquil evening into the timeless history of ancient Egypt. Part 34. The deepest hours of the night settled quietly over the Nile Valley. The villages rested beneath a sky overflowing with stars. Without the glow of modern lights, every constellation appeared bright and unmistakable, stretching across the heavens like a map that had guided generations for thousands of years. The moon had begun its slow journey toward the western horizon. Its silver light rested gently upon the Nile, transforming the flowing river into a ribbon of shimmering glass. Everything seemed peaceful. Everything seemed timeless. Along the edge of a quiet village, an elderly man named Ramos stepped outside his home before dawn. This had been his habit for as long as he could remember. He carried no tools, no basket, only a small clay cup filled with cool water. He sat upon a smooth stone facing the river and simply listened. The soft movement of water, the whisper of reeds, the distant cry of an owl returning to its nest. When his grandson quietly joined him, the boy asked, "Grandfather, what are you waiting for?" Ramos smiled. "I'm not waiting, I'm noticing." The boy looked puzzled. The old man pointed toward the horizon. "Most people spend their lives waiting for something. Wise learn to notice what is already here." Child sat beside him in silence. For the next several minutes, neither of them spoke. The lesson needed no further explanation. Nearby, a potter's kiln had finally cooled after burning through the night. A young apprentice carefully opened the clay door. Inside stood dozens of finished jars, bowls, and storage vessels. He examined each one closely. Most had survived perfectly. A few had cracked. He looked disappointed. His master gently picked up one of the broken pieces. "This teaches us too." Apprentice frowned. "How?" The older craftsman smiled. "Because every broken pot reminds us how to make the next one stronger. Failure was never wasted. It simply became another teacher." Farther down the Nile, a merchant vessel rested quietly beside a wooden dock. The crew slept peacefully beneath rolled linen blankets. Their journey would continue after sunrise. The cargo remained carefully covered: jars of honey, bundles of papyrus, fine linen, copper tools, sacks of grain. Each item represented the work of countless hands. The river connected them all. Long before roads crossed the deserts, the Nile had become Egypt's greatest highway. As the eastern sky slowly began changing from black to deep blue, the first cool breeze of morning drifted across the valley. Palm leaves rustled softly. Lotus flowers resting upon the water gradually opened their delicate petals to greet another sunrise. Nature always seemed to know exactly when a new day had arrived. No bells announced it. No voices commanded it. The world simply awakened. One by one, birds began singing from the papyrus marshes. Herons stretched their wings. Kingfishers flashed across the river like tiny blue arrows. A pair of ducks glided silently through the mist, leaving gentle ripples behind them. The Nile welcomed every creature equally. At the village bakery, warm firelight flickered once again inside the clay ovens. Fresh dough had already been shaped before dawn. Soon the first loaves would fill the streets with their comforting aroma. An elderly baker handed a small piece of warm bread to his youngest granddaughter. She smiled after her first bite. "It tastes the same every morning." The old baker laughed softly. "That's because some things become special by staying the same." Outside, farmers prepared their oxen, fishermen untied their boats. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes while carrying small clay jars toward the river. Life began again, not dramatically, not loudly, simply, peacefully. As the first golden rays of sunlight reached the tops of the palm trees, the entire Nile Valley seemed to glow with quiet hope. Another day had arrived, another opportunity to work honestly, to learn patiently, to help generously, to appreciate the simple gifts surrounding them. And while future generations would remember Egypt for its mighty pyramids and magnificent temples, the true spirit of the civilization continued to live in moments exactly like this: a calm sunrise, a loaf of warm bread, a family gathered together, a river that never stopped flowing, and ordinary people whose quiet lives became the foundation of one of history's most extraordinary civilizations. Part 35. The morning sun rose higher above the Nile Valley, spreading golden light across the fields and villages that had awakened with the familiar rhythm of another day. The river reflected the bright sky, carrying tiny waves toward the north as it had done for countless generations. Along the banks, farmers stepped carefully between rows of crops. Fishermen prepared their boats and craftsmen opened their workshops. The valley was alive, but it was not chaotic. Every person understood their place within the greater rhythm of life. Near a small farming settlement, a young boy named Jehudi followed his father into the fields. Today was the first day he would be trusted with a real farming tool. The wooden handle felt large in his small hands. He looked nervous. His father noticed and smiled. Do not worry about doing everything perfectly. Even the greatest farmers once held their first tool. Boy carefully pressed the tool into the soil. The first attempt was uneven. The second was better. By the 10th, his movements had become more natural. His father watched quietly. Growth rarely happened in one moment. It happened through many small attempts. Along another part of the riverbank, fishermen prepared a larger boat for a long journey. The vessel was built from carefully joined wooden planks and strengthened with strong ropes. Before departure, the captain inspected every section. The younger crew members were eager to begin. One asked, "Are we ready?" The captain smiled. "We are ready when we have checked everything twice." Young sailor laughed, but he understood the wisdom behind the words. A successful journey began long before the boat touched the water. Across the village, a group of artisans worked together inside a shaded courtyard. One sculptor shaped stone, another painted detailed patterns, a third prepared natural pigments made from minerals and plants. Their work required different skills, but every person depended upon the others. A beautiful creation was never the work of one hand alone. It was the result of many people sharing knowledge. Nearby, a young girl watched a painter carefully mix colors. She was fascinated by how simple materials became something beautiful. "Where does the blue come from?" she asked. The painter showed her small pieces of mineral that would eventually create a deep, lasting color. "The earth," he explained. "World gives us everything we need. Only need to learn how to use it." Girl looked at the small stones differently after that. They were no longer just rocks. They were hidden possibilities. As midday approached, the village slowed beneath the strong Egyptian sun. Many workers moved into shaded areas. Families shared meals beneath trees. Travelers rested beside the river before continuing their journeys. The Nile provided not only water and food, but also comfort. Its presence shaped every part of Egyptian life. In the marketplace, a merchant from a distant region exchanged stories with local traders. He spoke about lands beyond the deserts where unfamiliar animals lived and where different languages filled the streets. The listeners were fascinated. The world was much larger than their own village, yet the river connected them all. Every boat arriving from distant places carried a small piece of another world. As the afternoon breeze returned, farmers resumed their work. The fields needed attention, the animals needed care. The canals needed inspection. Life beside the Nile was peaceful, but it was never careless. The abundance of Egypt depended on constant effort. Toward the end of the day, the young farmer Jehudi looked back at the field where he had worked for the first time. The lines he created were not perfect. Some were uneven, but his father placed a hand on his shoulder. "Today you planted more than seeds. You planted experience." Boy smiled. He understood that every skill began with a single attempt. As the sun moved toward the western horizon, the golden light returned once again. The same beautiful colors appeared across the valley. The same river carried the same peaceful current. Yet this day was different. A child had taken his first step toward becoming a farmer. An apprentice had learned the value of preparation. A young artist had discovered the hidden beauty within nature. Another generation had received another lesson from the timeless Nile. And so, as evening approached, ancient Egypt continued its quiet journey through history, not only through monuments of stone, but through countless small moments of learning, kindness, and hope. Part 36. The evening breeze moved gently across the Nile Valley, carrying away the warmth of the afternoon sun. The field slowly changed color as the golden light of sunset touched every leaf, every palm tree, and every quiet pathway beside the river. The day was ending, But the story of the Nile continued. Along the riverbank, fishermen returned from their journeys. Some carried baskets filled with fish. Others returned with empty nets. Yet every boat came home with the same peaceful rhythm. The fishermen understood something that the river had taught them for generations. Not every day brought the same reward. But every day brought another lesson. An old fisherman named Senmut sat beside his boat, repairing a small tear in his net. His grandson watched closely. "Grandfather," the boy asked, "how do you know when a net is strong enough?" Senmut smiled. "You do not know by looking at it once. You learn by caring for it every day." He lifted the net carefully. A strong net is not made only from good fibers. It is made from attention. Boy touched the woven strands gently. He began to understand that even simple objects carried stories of patience. Nearby, farmers guided their animals back toward their homes. The oxen walked slowly along familiar paths. Their shadows stretched across the earth as the sun continued to disappear. Children ran ahead, laughing as they carried small bundles of reeds collected during the day. Their voices echoed softly through the village. Inside the homes, families prepared the evening meal. Clay lamps were cleaned and filled with oil. Bread was placed on woven mats. Fresh vegetables were arranged in simple bowls. The meal was not grand, but it was shared, and that made it valuable. Across the Nile, a small group of travelers rested beside their campfire. They had arrived after crossing a long stretch of desert. The journey had been difficult, the heat had been intense, the road had been uncertain, but reaching the river brought relief. The Nile was more than water, it was safety, it was life. It was the place where distant travelers finally felt they had returned to civilization. The travelers exchanged stories with nearby villagers. They spoke about distant lands, unfamiliar customs, and the places they had seen beyond the desert horizon. The villagers listened with curiosity. Every story expanded their understanding of the world. At the temple courtyard, priests prepared for the evening rituals. The stone columns reflected the fading sunlight. Incense slowly rose into the air, carrying a gentle fragrance through the quiet space. The ceremonies were not only about worship, they were also about preserving traditions, knowledge, and the connection between generations. Young apprentices watched carefully. Someday, they too would teach others what they had learned. As darkness approached, the first stars appeared above the valley. One by one, they returned to their familiar places. The ancient Egyptians looked upward with the same curiosity that humans have always shared. The sky was a great mystery, yet it was also a source of comfort. The stars returned. The sun returned. The Nile returned every morning. The world followed a rhythm that felt dependable. Near the village edge, an elderly storyteller gathered children beneath a palm tree. Tonight, he shared a tale about a wise farmer who discovered that the greatest treasures were not gold or jewels. They were friendship, family, knowledge, and the ability to appreciate ordinary moments. The children listened quietly. Perhaps they did not fully understand the meaning yet, but years later they would remember the words. As the moon rose higher, the village slowly became silent. The sounds of work disappeared, the sounds of rest began. The gentle movement of the river, the whisper of the wind, the distant call of night birds. The Nile continued flowing beneath the stars. It carried the memories of everyone who had lived beside it: farmers, fishermen, builders, teachers, children, families. Their names might disappear from written records, but their lives became part of something much greater. They became part of the endless story of ancient Egypt, a story written not only in stone, but in every sunrise, every sunset, and every peaceful moment beside the eternal Nile. Part 37. The night passed quietly over the Nile Valley, and once again the first signs of morning began appearing in the eastern sky. A soft silver glow replaced the darkness. The stars slowly faded. The cool air carried the scent of the river, fresh reeds, and the fertile earth that had supported generations of Egyptian families. The valley was preparing to awaken. Before most people had opened their eyes, a few early workers were already beginning their daily routines. The baker returned to his clay oven. The fishermen walked toward their boats. The farmers checked the condition of their fields. The rhythm of life beside the Nile began again. Near a small village garden, an elderly gardener named Horace stood quietly among rows of plants. He had spent his entire life caring for the land. His hands showed the evidence of many years of work, yet his movements remained gentle. A young apprentice followed him, carrying a basket of fresh herbs. "Master," the boy asked, "how do you know exactly when a plant needs water?" The old gardener touched the soil. "Because the soil tells you." He lifted a small handful. "You must learn to notice the small signs, the leaves, the color, feeling of the earth." The boy listened carefully. He was beginning to understand that true knowledge came not only from instructions but from experience. A short distance away, farmers prepared the irrigation channels that carried water from the Nile toward their fields. The work required cooperation. One person cleared the channel, another repaired the edges, another checked the flow of water. No single person could manage the entire system alone. The success of everyone depended on the effort of everyone. This understanding was one of the hidden strengths of Egyptian civilization. Many people working quietly together created something extraordinary. Along the river, merchants loaded their boats for another journey. A captain carefully examined his vessel before allowing the crew to begin. The young sailors were eager to depart. They wanted adventure. They wanted to see distant places. But the captain reminded them, the safest journey begins before the first wave. Every rope, every container, every piece of equipment had a purpose. Preparation created confidence. In the village marketplace, craftsmen opened their workshops. A woodworker shaped a chair from carefully selected timber. A jeweler arranged colorful beads into a necklace. A weaver continued creating fine linen cloth using methods passed down through many generations. Each person worked with the same quiet dedication. They were not simply creating objects, they were continuing traditions. Near the temple school, young students practiced writing symbols onto pieces of broken pottery. Their teacher walked among them, offering gentle advice. One student struggled with a difficult symbol and became frustrated. The teacher sat beside him. "Do not measure yourself against those who are already finished. Measure yourself against who you were yesterday." Student looked at his writing again. Slowly, he tried once more. This time, the symbol was clearer. Small improvements created great achievements over time. By midday, the village slowed beneath the bright Egyptian sun. People rested beneath shaded areas. Children shared stories while eating fruit. Travelers cooled themselves beside the river. The Nile continued to provide a peaceful center around which life moved. As the afternoon approached, a group of musicians gathered near the marketplace. They played simple melodies using harps, flutes, and drums. The music traveled through the streets, bringing smiles to those who heard it. No grand celebration was taking place. There was no special occasion. They simply believed that music had a place in ordinary days, and perhaps that was why it felt so meaningful. As the sun began its journey toward the western horizon, the entire valley seemed to slow once again. Boats returned, markets quieted, families gathered. The same cycle continued. Yet every day carried something different, a new lesson, a new memory. A new moment that would never return exactly the same way. The Nile taught this better than anything else. The river was always moving, but it was always the Nile. Change and continuity existed together. And beside that eternal river, the people of ancient Egypt continued building a civilization not only of stone and monuments, but of patience, wisdom, connection, and countless peaceful moments that shaped history forever. Part 38. Another peaceful evening descended upon the Nile Valley. The golden sunlight slowly disappeared behind the western desert, leaving the sky painted with soft shades of orange, pink, and violet. The river reflected every color above it, creating a moving picture that changed with every passing moment. The people of ancient Egypt had witnessed countless sunsets, yet each one still carried its own quiet beauty. Along the riverbank, a young boat builder named Amen carefully inspected the final details of a small wooden vessel. The boat was not designed for royalty. It was not built for war. It was simply meant to carry fishermen, families, and travelers safely across the river. But Amen treated it with the same respect given to the greatest ships. His apprentice watched him smooth the wooden surface one final time. "Why spend so much time on a small boat?" the young man asked. Amen smiled. "Because the person inside it does not think it is small." Apprentice looked at the boat differently after hearing those words. Every creation mattered because someone depended upon it. Nearby, Farmers returned from their fields carrying the tools they had used throughout the day. Their clothes were covered with dust. Their hands showed signs of hard work, yet their faces were peaceful. They had cared for the land. They had protected the crops. They had continued the work their ancestors began many generations earlier. That was enough. At the village fountain, children gathered around their parents as evening water was collected. They laughed and played while older family members exchanged stories. A grandmother pointed toward the river and explained how the Nile had changed the lives of countless generations. "River gives us more than water," she said. "It gives us memories." Children looked across the flowing water. They could not yet understand the full meaning of her words, but they would remember them. Inside a nearby home, a family prepared a special evening meal for a visiting relative who had returned after many years away. The table was simple. The food was humble. But the happiness was unmistakable. Fresh bread was shared first, then vegetables, fish, and sweet fruits. The guest told stories about distant cities, different landscapes, and people he had met along his journey. Everyone listened carefully. Travelers carried more than goods. They carried experiences. They carried knowledge. They carried pieces of the wider world back home. Farther away, beneath the shadow of a great temple, a group of young students studied ancient writings. Their teacher explained that knowledge was a treasure that grew when it was shared. A single idea passed from one person to another could influence generations. A simple lesson taught today could shape someone's future tomorrow. The students looked at the old scrolls with new appreciation. They were not merely reading words. They were connecting with voices from the past. As darkness slowly covered the valley, the stars appeared one by one. The moon rose above the eastern horizon, casting a peaceful glow across the fields. The sounds of the village softened. The marketplace became quiet. The workshops closed. The boats rested. The homes filled with warm light near the river. An elderly fisherman sat alone for a few moments. He watched the water move beneath the moon. After a lifetime beside the Nile, he still found comfort in its endless motion. The river reminded him that everything changes. People grow older. Children become parents. New generations arrive. But certain things continue: the flow of water, the rising sun, the return of the seasons, the simple kindness of one person helping another. As midnight approached, the village slowly entered deep rest. The Nile continued its journey through the darkness. The pyramids stood silently beneath the stars. The desert winds moved gently across the land. And another day became part of the endless history of ancient Egypt. Not a day remembered because of battles or kings, but because ordinary people lived it with patience, purpose, and gratitude. And sometimes, those are the moments that truly create history. Part 39, the first light of dawn once again touched the eastern edge of the Nile Valley. A thin golden line appeared above the horizon, slowly replacing the darkness of night. The river welcomed the morning sunlight, and thousands of small reflections danced across the water like tiny pieces of gold. Another day had begun. The valley awakened slowly, not with noise, not with confusion, but with the calm certainty of a world that had followed the same natural rhythm for generations. Near the riverbank, fishermen stepped into their boats while the air was still cool. They moved quietly, careful not to disturb the peaceful morning. The oldest fisherman among them, named Painesi, had spent more than 50 years on the Nile. A young boy who often joined him watched as he prepared the fishing nets. "Grandfather," the boy asked, "how did you learn everything about the river?" Painesi smiled. "Never finished learning." Boy looked surprised. Even after 50 years, the old fisherman looked toward the flowing water. "River changes every day, so we must keep learning too." Those words stayed with the boy. He began to understand that wisdom was not knowing everything. Wisdom was continuing to learn. Across the fields, farmers began their morning work. The rich black soil of the Nile floodplain remained one of Egypt's greatest gifts. With careful planting and irrigation, the land produced crops that supported entire communities. Wheat, barley, vegetables, and fruit grew in abundance. But the farmers never forgot that the river deserved respect. The Nile could provide. The Nile could also challenge. Understanding nature was essential. Nearby, a group of workers repaired a small section of an irrigation channel. The work was simple but important. A damaged canal could affect many families. Each person carefully carried mud, stones, and reeds to strengthen the structure. No one considered the task too small. They knew that a civilization depended upon thousands of small responsibilities completed every day. At the village market, activity slowly increased. Merchants arranged their goods beneath woven coverings. Fresh bread was placed beside baskets of fruit. Potters displayed newly finished bowls. Weavers unfolded beautiful linen fabrics created from hours of patient work. The marketplace was more than a place for buying and selling. It was a place where people met, where friendships grew, where information traveled. A farmer might learn about distant villages. A merchant might hear news from another region. A traveler might discover a new idea. The market was one of the many ways the Nile connected Egypt together. Near a quiet temple courtyard, a young artist carefully painted symbols onto a stone wall. His teacher watched from nearby. The apprentice worried that his work was not perfect. "I'm afraid I will make mistakes," he admitted. The teacher smiled. Every masterpiece begins as an imperfect first attempt. Your goal is not to avoid mistakes. Your goal is to learn from them. Young artist returned to his work with renewed confidence. His hands became steadier. His understanding became deeper. By afternoon, the strong sunlight covered the valley. Many people rested beneath shaded areas. Families shared food. Children played beside their homes. Elders told stories about the past. The hottest hours of the day often became moments of connection. People slowed down, they talked, they remembered, they listened. As the sun began lowering toward the western horizon, the fields turned golden once again. Birds flew back toward their nests. Boats began their journey home. The sounds of work gradually became softer. Another day was ending. But before the village rested, many small acts of kindness had taken place. A neighbor had helped repair a wall. A teacher had encouraged a student. A fisherman had shared his knowledge. A family had welcomed a traveler. None of these moments would be carved into stone. None would appear on the walls of grand temples. Yet these were the moments that truly shaped Egyptian society. Because civilizations are not only built by rulers, they are built by people, by patience, by cooperation, by countless quiet actions repeated every day. And as the Nile continued flowing beneath the evening sky, it carried another peaceful chapter forward into the endless story of ancient Egypt. Part 40. The evening sky slowly darkened above the Nile Valley, and the final golden rays of sunlight disappeared behind the western desert. The river became quieter. The fields rested beneath the cool breeze. Palm trees moved gently as if whispering ancient stories carried through countless generations. Another day had completed its journey, and like every evening beside the Nile, there was a peaceful moment between activity and rest, a moment when the world seemed to slow. Along a small village path, an elderly craftsman named Mena walked back toward his home carrying a basket of tools. For many years he had created wooden furniture, farming equipment, and simple household objects. His hands were no longer as strong as they once were. His hair had turned silver, but his knowledge remained valuable. A young apprentice walked beside him. "Master," the boy asked, "will I ever become as skilled as you?" Mena smiled. "You will become different from me." Boy looked confused. The old craftsman continued, "A good teacher does not create another copy of himself. Good teacher helps someone discover their own ability." Apprentice remembered those words. He realized that learning was not about becoming someone else. It was about becoming the best version of himself. Nearby, families gathered outside their homes as the evening temperature became comfortable. The narrow streets filled with quiet conversations. Neighbors exchanged greetings. Children played simple games using stones and wooden pieces. Older people sat together, remembering events from many years earlier. The community itself became a place of comfort. No one needed grand entertainment. Companionship was enough. At the edge of the river, a group of young sailors prepared their sleeping area beside their boat. Their journey would continue in the morning. Tonight, they rested beneath the stars. One sailor looked toward the massive pyramids visible in the distance. "Do you ever wonder how people built things so great?" he asked. An older sailor answered, "Great things are usually made from small efforts repeated for a long time." He pointed toward their own boat. This vessel also began as separate pieces of wood. Someone had to shape each piece. Someone had to join them together. Patience creates what seems impossible. The young sailors looked at the boat differently after that. Even simple things carried lessons about greatness. Inside a small home near the marketplace, a grandmother taught her grandchildren an old family recipe. She carefully measured ingredients without using written instructions. Her hands knew the exact amount needed. The children watched closely. One day, they would prepare the same meal for their own families. Traditions survived because someone cared enough to teach them. Far away, inside a temple library, a group of scribes continued their work beneath the soft light of oil lamps. They copied records, preserved stories, recorded important events. Their work required patience and concentration. A single mistake could change meaning, so every symbol was written carefully. The scribes understood that they were protecting knowledge for future generations. They were creating a bridge between the past and the future. As the moon rose higher, the village slowly became quieter. The last conversations faded. The final lamps were lowered. The sounds of nighttime returned. Crickets sang among the grass. Frogs called from the riverbanks. The Nile continued its endless movement beneath the stars. For thousands of years, people had watched this same river flow. They had seen different rulers, different generations, different dreams, yet the river remained. It carried memories of farmers who planted seeds, builders who shaped stones, artists who painted walls, parents who raised children, teachers who shared wisdom. The famous monuments of Egypt told only one part of the story. The quieter part lived in homes, fields, workshops, and villages. It lived in the ordinary people who created extraordinary history through their daily lives. And as another peaceful night covered the Nile Valley, the river continued flowing silently onward, carrying the dreams of one generation toward the next, carrying the timeless story of ancient Egypt forever. Part 41. Before the first light of dawn appeared, the Nile Valley rested beneath a deep and peaceful silence. The desert winds had become gentle. The river moved slowly through the darkness, reflecting the faint glow of the stars above. For a few quiet moments, the entire valley seemed suspended between night and morning. Then, as it had done for thousands of years, Egypt awakened. The first sounds were small, a bird calling from a distant palm tree, the soft movement of water against the riverbank, the crackling of a fire being prepared inside a clay oven. Slowly, these small sounds joined together, creating the familiar beginning of another day. Inside a modest home near the river, a young girl named Tia watched her mother prepare bread. She had seen this process many times before: the mixing of grain, the shaping of dough, the careful placement inside the warm oven. But today felt different. Today, her mother allowed her to prepare the dough herself. Tia looked nervous. "What if I make it wrong?" her mother smiled. "Then tomorrow you will know how to make it better." Girl carefully began. Her first attempt was not perfect, but it was hers, and that made it special. Across the village, farmers walked toward the fields carrying their tools. The morning air was still cool, making it the perfect time for work. They inspected the crops, checked irrigation channels, and prepared the land for future planting. A farmer's work was never finished. The earth always needed attention, but there was satisfaction in caring for something that provided life. Near the river, a group of fishermen pushed their boats into the water. The oldest among them paused before leaving the shore. He looked across the Nile and whispered a quiet expression of gratitude, not because every day was easy, but because every day was another opportunity. The younger fishermen noticed. They understood that respect for the river was more than a tradition. It was a way of life. At the village workshop, a group of craftsmen began creating new tools. A metalworker carefully shaped copper, a carpenter carved wooden handles, a leather worker prepared strong straps. Each person contributed a different skill. Together, they created things that made everyday life easier. No single craftsman could do everything. The strength of the community came from cooperation. Near the temple grounds, students gathered for another lesson. Their teacher brought a simple piece of pottery covered with old writing. "This may look ordinary," he explained. "It carries a message from someone who lived many years ago." Students leaned closer. They realized that every written mark represented a person who once lived, worked, loved, and dreamed. The past was not only found in great monuments, it was also found in small pieces of everyday life. By midday, the sun climbed high above the valley. The strong heat encouraged people to slow their pace. Families rested beneath shaded areas. Travelers sat beside the river. Workers shared food and conversation. The quiet hours of the afternoon became a reminder that life was not meant to be rushed. In the shade of a large tree, an elderly storyteller spoke to a group of children. He told them about a farmer who planted trees even though he knew future generations would enjoy their shade more than he would. A child, would someone do that? The storyteller looked toward the tall palms surrounding the village. Because someone did it for us. Children looked around. Suddenly, they noticed the trees differently. They were not just plants, they were gifts from people they would never meet. As the afternoon slowly moved toward evening, the Nile continued flowing peacefully. The boats traveled. The birds returned. The fields moved gently in the wind. Another day passed. Another collection of small moments became part of history. And once again, the ancient river reminded everyone who lived beside it. The greatest achievements are not always created in a single moment. They are built slowly, through patience, through kindness, through generations of ordinary people doing their part, just like the endless Nile itself. Part 42, the evening arrived softly over the Nile Valley, bringing with it the familiar peace that followed another day of work. The harsh brightness of the sun faded into a gentle golden glow. The fields appeared like waves of green beneath the changing sky. The river reflected the last colors of the sunset, carrying them northward toward the distant sea. For the people of ancient Egypt, evening was a time of reflection, a time to leave behind the tasks of the day and appreciate the simple blessings that surrounded them. Along a quiet path beside the river, an old farmer named Hori walked slowly toward his home. He carried a small bundle of fresh vegetables from his garden. His steps were slower than they had been in his youth, but his eyes still carried the same peaceful happiness. A young neighbor saw him and offered to carry the basket. Hori smiled. "Thank you, my friend. Day, you will need help too. When that day comes, someone will be there for you." Young man understood. Kindness was not a single action. It was a tradition passed from one person to another. Nearby, a family prepared their evening meal. A mother arranged fresh bread on a woven tray. A father poured water into clay cups. Children gathered around, eager to hear stories from their grandfather. The old man spoke about the Nile, not only as a river but as a companion. "It has seen every generation before us," he explained. "It carried the boats of our ancestors. It watered the fields of our grandparents. It will continue carrying life long after we are gone." Children listened quietly to them. The river seemed almost alive. At the village marketplace, the last merchants packed away their goods. Clay jars were covered, baskets were stored, linen cloth was carefully folded. Before leaving, merchants exchanged friendly greetings. Another successful day had ended. Not every day brought great profit, but every day brought another chance to build trust. Farther along the riverbank, a group of young builders worked on repairing an old stone pathway. The path had been used for many years by farmers, merchants, and travelers. Some stones had become loose. Others had cracked beneath countless footsteps. The young workers carefully replaced each damaged piece. An older builder watched them. "Why repair something so old?" one apprentice asked. The man smiled. "Because someone repaired it before us, are only continuing what they started." Apprentice looked down at the ancient stones. Each one carried the marks of time. Each one represented countless journeys. Near the temple, a group of musicians practiced a quiet evening melody. Their instruments were simple: a wooden flute, a small drum, a carefully crafted harp. Yet the music filled the courtyard with warmth. A young child sitting nearby closed her eyes and listened. She did not understand the meaning of every note, but she understood the feeling. Sometimes music communicated what words could not. As darkness slowly covered the valley, stars began appearing above the river. The same stars that farmers, sailors, and travelers had watched for generations. The night sky connected the present with the distant past. A person looking upward thousands of years ago saw the same endless universe. That thought brought comfort. Near midnight, the village became completely still. The final lamps disappeared, the last voices faded. The Nile continued its gentle journey beneath the moonlight. The pyramids stood silently in the distance. The desert rested, the fields waited for another sunrise, And somewhere inside the quiet homes of Egypt, children dreamed of tomorrow. They dreamed of becoming farmers, builders, artists, scribes, explorers. They did not know what the future would bring, but they lived in a world shaped by patience and hope. A world where every sunrise offered a new beginning, and every peaceful night became another page in the endless story of ancient Egypt.